welcome everyone who has joined us. We are now live on Facebook. Very happy to have everyone here. Give me 1 minute to exit full screen. Okay, so I'd like to welcome to the second day of the symposium on the Desire of Psychoanalysis. We have a very exciting day in store for you. We have two panels. I want to start with a few housekeeping items. The first is we'd like to thank everyone that's already purchased a ticket. A huge portion of the ticket sales will be actually contributed to different psychoanalytic efforts in Brazil that are working with victims of state violence and people that are bringing psychoanalysis to classes of people that are very much usually excluded from the psychoanalytic couch. I'd also like to mention that you can purchase The Desire of Psychoanalysis at the Northwestern University Press website, which will be in the Zoom chat or in the Facebook stream. Go there and enter the passcode psychoanalysis and you'll get a 30% discount on the book. We encourage you to support the press. This book by Gabriel is part of the Diaresis series, edited by Žižek, Todd McGowan, and Adrian Johnson. This symposium is organized by study groups in psychoanalysis and politics. This is a virtual collective that we launched exactly 1 year ago as the COVID-19 pandemic forced us all into isolation. So what we do is we offer study opportunities, seminars, and we organize reading groups on psychoanalytic and Marxist texts. You can check out our sessions on Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Karatani's The Structure of World History, and Lazarus's Anthropology of the Name on our YouTube channel. If you feel so inclined today to tweet about this event, please use the hashtag Desire of Psychoanalysis. Let me also intend that we announce to track the various questions and themes that come up and host a follow-up series of events with Tupinambá there. So if your questions don't get answered, we'll have kind of more intimate opportunities in the future. The final panel today is in the Portuguese language, and it's not going to be in English. It's going to spotlight 3 psychoanalytic projects that are doing highly innovative work throughout Brazil. The first one is called Clinical Margins, and Clinical Margins works with victims of state violence. Second one is called Psychoanalysis in the Streets, which provides psychoanalytic services to the poor. And the third one is called Perifé Analysis, which is also bringing psychoanalysis at a mass level in Brazil. So this symposium is happening in a time in which the Lacanian field is mired in a clear political crisis. Psychoanalysis seems incapable of addressing certain antagonisms, class exclusions and hierarchies, the transsexual movement, and there seems to be a kind of latent liberal embrace of the status quo amongst Lacanians. This crisis of Lacanian thought begs the question, is there something conservative in Lacan's thought? That is Lacanian thought itself implicitly conservative? Or perhaps more optimistically, for the future of Lacanian thought, is this crisis the result of idiosyncratic psychoanalytic masters that retain institutional power? How do we treat Lacanian theory in relation to the impasses and profound contradictions of our time? Why has the transsexual issue caused such discord and crisis amongst Lacanians? For many of us, we look at these debates with embarrassment. But perhaps the good news is that they force us to revisit Lacan himself, to return to the very core. For these reasons, we are pleased to present our first panel, which is entitled New Theoretical Directions in Lacanian Psychoanalysis, with speakers Slavoj Žižek, Alenka Zupančič, and Patricia Garavichi. We've invited these speakers to address us in such a way that they can feel at liberty to get into the technical sides of Lacanian thought and to dig deeper into the theoretical issues that have been raised in Gabriel Tupinambá's incredible book, The Desire of Psychoanalysis. To kick us off, we have Slavoj Žižek. For well over 20 years, Slavoj has introduced Lacan to an entire generation. His thought has influenced the way we understand the world, the function of power, and of ideology. I would say without Žižek's interventions over these years, just imagine what the Lacanian field might look like. Slavoj wrote the foreword to The Desire of Psychoanalysis, where he discusses the way that Tupinamba's text enables a new understanding. And today he's going to focus on the question of historicism. He will speak for 40 minutes, and then we will immediately go to questions. Please welcome Slavoj Žižek.
I'm on. Thanks very much. I'm truly honored to be here. Why? The saddest text I've read lately are Jacqueline Miller's ruminations on Judith Butler and the transgender movement, a document of his provincial spirit and growing irrelevance. This text in itself shows why the renovation of the Lacanian thought and practice advocated by Tupinambá is an urgency today. Not only does his book spoil the ideological game that predominated in Lacanian circles for decades, Tupinambá compels us to confront the philosophical implications of psychoanalysis. I already wrote elsewhere about all this. I just want to, in a very personal manner, to give you an empirical proof that I'm fascinated by Tupinamba's book and I admire it. You know why? When I read the book, there was no kindness in me. Oh, I admire you, what a book. It was envy and hatred. Why wasn't it me who wrote such a beautiful book? That's for me the ultimate honest proof that, well, things changed. Let me begin now with the difficult relationship between the analytic clinic and the universal theory that emerges out of it. Theory of signifier, of four discourses, and so on. Yes, Freudian theory is rooted in clinical experience, but the task of analytic theory is not just to relativize itself in this way. It is also to account for the very possibility of something like clinical experience in terms of universal human predicament. How is our symbolic space structured so that a couple of analysants and analysts can operate the way it does, contravening the standard form of intersubjective exchanges? For Lacan, the dyad analyst-analysant is not just an artificial exception, but an exception to, or a distortion of, normal communication which brings out a basic feature of the social link. Discourse obfuscated in so-called normal intersubjectivity. For Freud, as well as for Marx, the exception is the key to normality. So how should we historicize the psychoanalytic experience? Tupinambá actually refers here to the Kantian distinction between negative judgments, judgments that negate a predicate, like he is not dead, and infinite judgments, judgments that assert a non-predicate, like he is undead. Along the same lines, Tupinambá proposes the distinction between the negation of positive universals and the affirmation of negative universals. While fully endorsing this line of thought, I would just give it a slightly different reading. Maybe it's not different at all. Negation of positive universals reached its peak in postmodern historicist relativism. Every positive universality is deconstructed. It is demonstrated how this universality is biased, how it secretly privileges and eternalizes a content which is a contingent historical variable. But we should always bear in mind that ideology is not only the eternalization of a specific historical situation. It is also the reduction of something that is constitutive of the entire field to a specific contingent property. Ideology is not only the elevation of capitalism into the most appropriate and rational economic order, ideology is also the dismissal of crises and antagonisms that characterize capitalism into a deviation due to particular unfortunate circumstances, and the accompanying idea that another capitalism is possible which would avoid crises and antagonisms. Along these lines, Frederick Jameson rejected the once fashionable notion of alternate modernities, the idea that our Western liberal capitalist modernity is just one of the paths to modernization, and that other paths are possible which could avoid the deadlocks and antagonisms of our modernity. Once we realize that modernity is ultimately a code name for capitalism, it is easy to see that such historicist relativization of our modernity is sustained by the ideological dream of a capitalism which would avoid its constitutive antagonisms. Was fascism not an exemplary case of alternate modernity? In a strictly homologous way, the reduction of the impasses of sexuality to a specific historical constellation, say, of Western patriarchy, opens up the space for the utopia of a full sexuality without its impasses and perversions, which, as Freud demonstrated, inhabit its very notion. The point of this ideological deadlock is to supplement the negation of positive universals with the assertion of negative universals, with an impossibility constitutive of the entire domain. Yes, all positive identities are relative, unstable. There are so many attempts to deal with the same underlying antagonism. And what triggers change is the ultimate failure of every attempt to resolve this antagonism. One of Lacan's negative universals is, of course, il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel. There is no sexual relationship, which means that it is not enough to point out the immanent instability and historical character of the traditional gender binary. One should also add that every determinate form of gender relationship, no matter how open and flexible it is, will fail to overcome the impossibility constitutive of human sexuality. Here I find, listen, Gabriel, and sharpen your knife to strike back. Here I find a little bit problematic Tupinamba's critique of what he calls structural dialectics, his attempt to historicize the real. According to Tupinambá, the logic of the signifier, the core of structural dialectics, ontologizes into a universal frame, the differential structure caught into a self-referential movement of circulating around its constitutive impossibility. And within this frame, the real appears as the impossible of this structure and as such as an ahistorical limit, the elusive excess that defines the structure itself. However, according to Tupinambá, this ontologization of the logic of signifier is based on ignoring the fact that it is rooted in the artificially produced analytic situation, a situation engendered by the enclosure of the clinical space, analysant. The real is the impossible excluded from and by this situation, and such a historical variable which can be analyzed as part of another wider reality. I think we can now understand in what sense for Tupinambá what is ultimately to blame for Lacan's limitations are his philosophical commitments, as they are discernible in his elevation of the logic of the signifier into an ontological a priori. The logic of the signifier, the ultimate frame of our access to reality, provides de facto a kind of transcendental frame to our access to reality. What eludes it cannot be conceptualized in Lacan as another reality, but can only appear as a limit phenomenon, an elusive virtual point of reference, ultimately defined only by our failure to reach it. So the real is not just impossible for us to grasp. It is impossible in itself. It fully coincides with its own impossibility. And Tupinambá rather dismissively refers to this redoubling of impossibility to Lacan's claim that we only touch the real through the failure of our attempts to grasp it as a proof by impotence. Quote from Tupinambá, the impotence of the model counts as the potency of the proof. End of quote. It is here that I, again, slightly, maybe, I'm sure of nothing, disagree with Tupinambá. I think that he gets all too easily rid of the subversive power of the proof by impotence, which indicates the pivotal point at which Lacan's motive of the overlapping of two legs, subject's leg and the leg in the other, echoes the basic, in my reading, the basic Hegelian motive of the problem deadlock as its own solution. In my past work, I was obsessively returning to this motive, enumerating examples. Say, the well-known Adorno's analysis of the antagonistic character of our notion of society. In the split between the two notions of society, Anglo-Saxon individualistic, nominalistic notion and Durkheimian, Emile Durkheim, organicist notion of society as a totality which pre-exists individuals, this split seems irreducible. We seem to be dealing with a Kantian antinomy which cannot be resolved via a higher synthesis. So that society appears as an inaccessible thing in itself. However, I think that to resolve this deadlock, we should merely take note of how this antinomy, which seems to preclude our access to the thing, already is the thing itself. The fundamental feature of today's society is the irreconcilable antagonism between totality and the individual. What this means is that ultimately, the status of the real, for me, is purely parallactic and as such non-substantial. The real has no substantial density in itself. It is just a gap between 2 points of perspective, perceptible only in the shift from the one to the other. The parallactic real is that which accounts for the very multiplicity of appearances. It is not the hard core which persists as the same, but the hard bone of contention which pulverizes the sameness into a multitude of appearances. Now I come to the first crucial point. For Tupinambá, this refusal to think the real in itself, this reduction of the real to a mark or a trace of its own impossibility is, insofar as the unconscious is one of the names of the real, also, quote from Tupinambá, in the last instance, the reason why for Lacan, the unconscious must be conceived as an ethical instance and not as a psychoanalytic concept, end of quote. But I see this as a wrong alternative. Ethical is here a psychoanalytic concept. It designates the dimension of ought in Freud's formula, wo es war, soll ich werden. Where it was, I shall become. And as such, it points towards Lacan's refusal to ontologize the unconscious into a substance or substantial base of subject's psychic life. Here we encounter, I think so, a proof by impotence at its most trenchant. The inaccessibility of the unconscious is not just a sign of our epistemological limitation. of our inability to reach another side where the unconscious fully exists. The unconscious is in itself not fully existing. It dwells in the domain of neither being nor not being. Now we reach the next central motive of Tupinamba's critique of Lacan, his critical reading of Lacan's formulas of sexuation. To somehow simplify the line of argumentation, Tupinambá qualifies phallicism, the masculine side of the formulas of sexuation, as the logic of enclosure, totalization of a finite set, which generates what it excludes as a non-existing virtual excess that escapes language. And although Lacan deploys the feminine side of the formulas as escaping this logic of enclosure, he ultimately still conceives the feminine side, the infinite jouissance féminine, the way it appears from the masculine side, as an excess with no positive reality. But since Lacan's structural dialectics, whose core is the logic of the signifier, is ultimately, for Tupinambá, an illegitimate universalization of the way speech functions in psychoanalysis, one should not conceive feminine enjoyment as structurally inaccessible, but only as currently outside of our reach. So for Tupinambá, the epistemological implication of the phallic logic is clear. Since this logic can only conceive radical otherness external to the symbolic space as an immanent excess of this space itself, and since this immanent excess is part of our libidinal psychic reality, it has to generalize the properties of the psychic real over those of indifferent otherness. A quote from Tupinambá: "What is not the signifier exists only insofar as it remains marked within the signifying chain as a stumbling block that is then displaced to a phantasmatic exception with no actual existence." End of quote. My naive question, does this hold? It is true that some formulations in Lacan's seminar Encore are somewhat ambiguous. He does characterize feminine enjoyment as an excess outside language. But the main thrust of his argumentation is clear. There is no need for a function other than phallic function, to conceptualize femininity as it is in itself, and not just as something in excess of the phallic function. To see this, one should only read Lacan closely and literally. Femininity is defined, that's the paradox on which I insist, almost everybody disagrees here with me. Femininity is defined precisely by its full immersion into the phallic function. There is no exception to it, which is why, paradoxically, feminine position is more, not less, immersed into the field of phallicism. In my reading of the formulas of sexuation, I'm thus tempted to reach the exactly opposite conclusion. Is the externalization of what is not closed under phallicism, its externalization into an unfathomable otherness, not part of the masculine formulas, or to put it in more conventional terms, is the very idea of a substantial woman that eludes the masculine symbolic grasp, not part and parcel of masculine ideology. Tupinambá, of course, sees that, far from being limited to the relation between sexes, Lacan's formulas of sexuation are extraordinarily productive as a means to clarify other relations. For example, the basic feature of authentic historicity, as opposed to historicism, is that it is feminine in the sense of Lacan's formulas of sexuation. It abolishes this exception. It relativizes its own position and thus historicizes its own notion of historicity. It is in this sense that, for me, Hegel is a radical historicist. For him, every historical epoch, with every historical epoch, the universal notion of history also changes. Such an approach allows for no exception to historicity and is for this reason non-all. There is no single universal notion of historicity, since this notion is itself caught into the process of historical change. Historicism is not radical enough because it does not take into account how each historical break is not simply a break within history, but changes the very notion of history. This is why I think, frankly, we shouldn't dismiss as ridiculous Fukuyama's talk about the end of history in 1990. After the victory of global capitalism, the sense of history changed radically. So where does Tupinambá stand here? His central claim is that what eludes phallic domain, quote from him again, does not need to point to something that is structurally inaccessible. It could also mean that it is currently outside of our reach, end of quote. So when, in the very last paragraph of his book, of the manuscript, I read originally the manuscript, so I'm not sure if it's in the printed book, Tupinambá pleads for, quote, a new composability between transgender and feminist critiques on the one side and psychoanalysis on the other, end of quote, as a way to articulate positively, not just as a limit case, what is not closed under phallicism. I'm tempted to propose a counterclaim. In the same way that Tupinambá tries to separate Lacanian ideology from the radical core of Lacan's teaching, our task today is to separate the transgender and feminist ideology from the radical core of this movement. Only in this way can the movement be redeemed. And only Lacanian psychoanalysis combined with Marxism can do this job. This brings me back to the distinction between the negation of positive universals and the assertion of negative universals. In its ferocious negation of positive universals, emphasizing how the gender binary is a historical variable, not a transcendental a priori of human sexuality, the predominant form of transgender and feminist ideology forgets to assert a negative universal, the antagonism that characterizes human sexuality as such. So it ends up proposing an ideological vision of sexuality which, freed from patriarchal binary constraints, becomes a joyful experience or expression of our true selves, a practice of non-binary plasticity where a subject permanently experiments with itself and reconstructs itself, playing with different identities, from hetero to gay, from bisexual to asexual. But for me today, the true tyranny is the tyranny of this permanent rediscovery of new identities. All the conservative fundamentalist campaigns against contemporary hedonism, and egotism is for me a fake, a reactive phenomenon which is already contaminated, mediated by what it opposes. For example, is not the ultimate proof here Donald Trump himself, a ruthless hedonist posing as a partisan of conservative values? If there ever was a postmodern historicist president, politician, it's Trump. Along these lines, in a column that I want to quote briefly from The Guardian newspaper, Suzanne Moore praised Judith Butler's reduction of sex to gender. Quote, Butler writes, if the immutable character of sex is contested, this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. How immensely freeing that it is, end of quote. For Moore, the notion of sex designates an immutable, stable binary identity, masculine or feminine. It is a contingent social construct, but this contingency is obfuscated by a reference to biology. Sex is part of our natural identity or justified by ideology. Gender identity is, in contrast, a contingent social construct, and the experience of this contingency is immensely freeing. It opens up the space for freely shifting between different identities, a permanent shifting which runs smoothly, involving no antagonisms and tensions. So the idea is that antagonism and tension emerge when this open space of gender games is subordinated to the tyranny of sex, to the patriarchal order of binary opposites. Patriarchal order is about power, about the exercise of power and domination, and power is what sustains the passage from gender to sex. In short, gender identities move in the liberal space of the freedom of choice, a space which is inherently safe. Nobody controls me there, nobody tries to impose on me an identity which is not mine, while sex or sexuality as such involves abuse, violence, domination, and is as such the space of antagonisms. Well, I of course don't agree with this entire line of thought. Why not? The Lacanian reply is that what multiple gender identities exclude is not sexual difference as a stable hierarchical order, but the antagonism, unease, impossibility that defines this difference, sexual difference. Traditional heterosexual binary order admits the potential aggressiveness and tension that pertains to sexual difference, and it tries to contain it through the ideological notion of the harmonious relationship between the two sexes. Sexual antagonism is here repressed, but it remains as a potential threat. In the space of multiple gender identities, what is repressed returns with a vengeance. All sexual perversions, all violations of heterosexual normativity, they are not only permitted, but even solicited. However, the paradox is that repression gets much stronger in this return of the repressed. What is much more repressed than before in traditional heterosexuality is the immanent antagonism of sexuality. Now we come to the crux of the problem. But is the impossibility that pertains to sexuality not historical and as such variable? Why can't we imagine and practice a different sexuality no longer branded by a constitutive antagonism? A sexual relationship which is not structurally inaccessible, but just currently outside of our reach. Incidentally, it is sad to see how even Alain Badiou falls into this trap. His solution, his solution for our sexual predicament is the creation of a new symbolic space for men and women beyond traditional patriarchal hierarchy, but also beyond capitalist nihilism of the outlaw real. Such a new symbolic space can only arise by means of a properly philosophical gesture of the creation of new basic signifiers, of a new symbolization through which both sexes are reinvented. A new space where women are also scientists, politicians, artists, where men also deal with reproduction and so on. From the Lacanian perspective, however, the first thing to do is not to search for the traces of some new symbolization of sexual difference, but to interrogate what is in sexuality here and now, more than its patriarchal traditional symbolization. Without this interrogation, the dream of a new symbolic space of sexuality is just that, an empty dream, an ideological mirage that enables us to avoid the antagonism constitutive of human sexuality. But again, is this antagonism impossibility an ahistorical a priori? Lacan's answer seems easy to me here. It is, of course, not eternal, but it is constitutive of human sexuality. We can, of course, imagine an asexual reproduction or a life with totally different modalities of pleasure. But in this case, we are simply no longer dealing with sexuality. It is exactly like with alternate modernities. One thing is to pass from one to another form of modernity, say from liberal democracy to fascism or authoritarian populism, which are just different ways to deal with the underlying antagonism that defines capitalism. Another thing is to break out of the very field of modernity, inclusive of its constitutive antagonism. What do I want to say here? To simplify it to the utmost. Yes, of course, there is so-called external reality, which is out there independently of us. Who knows what is out there in the cosmos? The only thing we can be sure is that there is an infinite numbers of things we don't yet know. But this infinity of the external world is something profoundly indifferent, in itself banal, flat, and even stupid. The fact that we don't know it means just that we don't know it. There is no mystery here, no proper dialectics of appearance, no structural illusion in the proper dialectical sense. The impossibility of sexual relationship is, I think, something radically different. The mystery of sexuality, our structural need to supplement the lack of a fixed formula of sexual relationship with phantasmatic supplements, is constitutive of sexuality. It is what transforms animal mating into human eroticism. There is no external reality to be discovered behind the specter of fantasies. The only mystery is here the mystery of the form itself. In exactly the same way, Marx points out that the mystery of the commodity form is the mystery of this form itself, the rise of the form of mystery. Here we can see how the difference between the two reals, the real of the impossible thing and the indifferent external reality, is fundamental for Lacan. The source of metaphysical mystification resides precisely in the confusion between the two, in the identification of the libidinal thing from the inner space with the ultimate enigma of external reality. One could even say in a Kantian mode that this identification is a necessary transcendental illusion. External universe is not really a mystery. It is just whatever it is. It only appears a mystery when it gets caught in the deadlocks of our libidinal economy. Or to evoke again the anecdote often quoted by Lacan about Zeuxis and Parrhasius, the two painters from ancient Greece who compete to determine who can paint a more convincing illusion. You know the story. First, Zeuxis produced such a realist picture of grapes that birds tried to eat them. Then Parrhasius won by painting on the wall of his room a curtain so that Zeus asked him, okay, now please pull aside the veil and show me what you painted. In Zeuxis' painting, the illusion was so convincing that the image was taken for the real thing. In Parrhasius' painting, the illusion resides in the very notion that what the viewer saw in front of him was just a veil covering up the hidden truth. This is how mystery functions in a symbolic space. there is no mystery behind the veil. The only mystery to be explained is how to convincingly paint a veil that creates the illusion of a content hidden behind it. And incidentally, it's, I think, the same with social antagonisms. For example, if we were to ask today, how is the American political space, North American, structured? We would, if we were to ask this question, we would get a totally different answer from of Trump or from liberal center left. Trump would presented himself as the voice of the hardworking people against the corrupted, non-patriotic enemies of the people, and a liberal leftist would have presented himself as the last bulwark of human rights and freedoms against fascist demagoguery. So the real, that's what I was, the real is not the actual reality, social structure. The real is the antagonism which generates this opposite vision. And I like this parallel of sexual difference between social class antagonism, because I think we have the same attempt to deny binary logic also with some sociologists. They claim, oh, you are old-fashioned, there are not only two classes, there are many strata, many classes, and so on and so on. Of course there are, but the antagonism behind all this is one. Antagonism, precisely because it is antagonism, cannot be directly translated into a symbolic binary. Antagonism necessarily appears as at least three, or in classical Marxist term, we have the ruling class, the oppressed, but then we also necessarily have middle classes, those who are excluded from social body as such, and so on and so on. Why is this important today? Because I think that in struggle, in the feminist struggle, as well as in struggle for social emancipation, the temptation is the identity politics. For example, now, I don't know if you know it, but I notice now that in Germany, there is an interesting new trend called classism. The idea is that working class should be recognized in its specific cultural identity. Workers are taught to celebrate their identity, their small rituals, and so on. They have an identity of their own. I think this is the worst bourgeois ideology that you can imagine. It's basically even a fascist solution. It is, we give you your identity. But the struggle for the class struggle is not this. Class struggle is an attempt to live, to cancel myself as class and the opposite class. So to conclude, exactly 40 minutes, what I claim is that, that's my basic argument, where I would love to get Gabriel's answer. What I claim is that when Lacan speaks about this real as the constitutive antagonism, which has no real existence, but is just an immanent limit and so on, this is, of course, historical in the sense that it can disappear, but the entire field disappears without it. What is wrong with identity politics is that you want the same elements, workers, capitalists, state apparatus, but just in their more full identity, as fascists always repeated. Workers deserve full recognition, their honor, their dignity, and so on and so on. So I think, again, that it's crucial here to see the radicality of the change demand that when we want to move out, when we want to abolish a certain structural impossibility, we lose also the identities which generate this spectral X, the real as impossible. This, for me, is a totally different sphere. This is sphere of symbolic antagonisms and so on, which has nothing to do with the problem of so-called external reality. The real for Lacan is not the way things really are. I would even have said, and I did in some of my books, as the real for Lacan is precisely the force which the real is the force, the pressure which makes us to violate, distort the way things really are. When you see things in the wrong way, the real is that which forces you into this falsification. I can explain more books, but now I'm an obsessional neurotic. I think it's exactly 40 minutes and a half. Thanks very much. And Gabriel, please, I hope you sharpened your knife. This is not a rhetorical point in the sense that I know the truth now. I graciously allow you to agree with me or not. It's a debate, please.
Okay. I must say I was mildly prepared because I was aware already, because you told me, I read about a bit about the sort of position that you held with regards to this argument. And I do feel like that, I mean, I'm not so committed to the solutions I proposed in the chapter. I'm more committed to the problem that I think it deserves some proper answer. But the way that you formulated the critique now made it seem to me that perhaps the best way to answer, I mean, I wrote down some things here, but I feel like all of them come together in a point that wasn't exactly the point of critique, but I think that it might be the good place to start, because my point is this. I feel like the argument against structural dialectics in the book was in a large extent argued from many things that I mean read and learned from reading your books. So for me to see you defend or argue for this position, for me, is on the one hand a bit paradoxical, but on the other hand clarified something which that's why I say I think I should start from there. The thing that I'm trying to move beyond, and I think that it's hard to do, it's not easy to find the right way to express another way of dividing the question, is that there is something problematic, in my opinion, with for example, posing the problem in terms of sexuality with antagonism versus sexuality without antagonism. Because it's always the other that wants sexuality without antagonism. I've never seen anyone claim that politically. I mean, I have a lot of friends in different feminist movements. I've never seen anyone talk about this, struggle in the feminist struggle, and suppose this. I might have read it in books where people usually argue things in a more consistent way. So I think that, first of all, I have a bit of a problem. I think it's an unwanted consequence of framing things in terms of sexuality with antagonism, which is our monopoly, and sexuality without antagonism, which is what is left for social political movements. Because we don't want to, I think nobody wants to end up saying, look, you guys need us if you're going to do something new. For me, it's clear that no feminist movement needs Lacanians. It's no wonder that all Lacanian schools are now talking about sexuality, identity politics. They're running behind something. They're not running ahead. So my problem is, how do we change the axis from with or without antagonism to the question of different ways that antagonism is appearing? For example, when you use the example of the painting, the classic example by Lacan with the veil. Well, there is a very long history of painting veils. even though the real as a sort of surface without a substance or a point of impasse, a virtual excess is there, it can be deployed in infinite ways. But I think that depending on how we formulate this, it looks like that difference is no difference at all. The difference between a guy doing a painting in ancient Greece, which captures this, and the concrete struggle that it takes to do a new painting that also captures that difference in a different way, it's irrelevant. And I think it's irrelevant from the standpoint of philosophy. And it's not irrelevant from the standpoint neither of politics nor of psychoanalysis. And perhaps that marks a perspective shift, not a contradiction in the sense of a critical remark. And I think that this leads me to the point that I wanted to make, which I think is that it looks like, I mean, I don't talk about Hegel in the book very much. Yeah. I try to avoid it because I really didn't want to make this book very much about, I didn't want to make philosophical claims so much. I wanted to take the sort of philosophical debate that's already part of psychoanalysis to make a psychoanalytic claim. But I do think that there is a sort of symptom in Hegel that perhaps summarizes all of this, which is the two moments where Hegel had to deal with mathematical infinity. One in his thesis on Newton, like his doctoral thesis, which is slightly embarrassing, but it's also very interesting. And then in Science of Logic, where he talks about differential calculus, that very crazy passage about the never ends on differential calculus. And there, in both cases, you can feel a sort of resistance to accept that mathematics can solve its own problems. He proposes, he's talking about differential calculus, he has a really good understanding of it, and he says, you see, like this is not a good, mathematics doesn't know the concept of what it is doing. And then he says, well, this is why infinity belongs to philosophy. If you want to deal with infinity, with the infinitely small, you need a very strong philosophical notion behind it. But 10 years later, actually, while Hegel was writing this, mathematics moved on and pretty much put differential calculus in a different footing, in a different form. There is something like a problem there, in my opinion, for Hegel, because if mathematics can do that, then there are more ways to deal with certain philosophical ideas than philosophy itself. And I feel like there's something similar going on in this chapter. It's an argument against a certain dialectical approach. It concerns what happens when infinity is given the last word over the formalism in psychoanalysis. And my whole point in the chapter is that if we change the language in which we argue or construct Lacanian concepts, we get not the best of both worlds because it's a mess. It's still very complicated and not clear at all. But we do get a sense that we can keep the idea of antagonism, of the double status of the real as inaccessible and at the same time coming from within, never removed and never present at the same time. We get to keep that property of the real and still talk about extensions of the psychoanalytic field. My position is that we do get to talk about the Lacanian real in a way where we can no longer make the distinction between sexuality with antagonism or without antagonism. I feel like there's something about the way of dividing these two fields, these two positions, that is more historic. That's the historically determined thing, not sexuality. My point is precisely, I mean, that's usually my kind of position today, though it took me a long time to get to it. But I feel like if I truly stay close to Lacan, I should be open to listen to the ways that this antagonism will appear in ways that I didn't. It's not a matter of it won't appear. It will. But the issue is, how will it appear? And I want a theory that is flexible enough that I might also say not only that it will, even though it will, I have no idea how it will, and it might require a great creative, constructive process for this appearance to emerge. So I don't think that putting it in terms of accepting something that's not the phallic function such as it is established today is to necessarily espouse the inverse. Therefore, you want something without an antagonism. And I think that this is useful not only I mean, to give a concrete example, if somebody is speaking from the couch to their analyst, obviously there is the very well clinically documented, discussed phenomena of the construction of the idea that something is not being said, something is beyond what I'm saying. At the same time, you're constantly haunted by the very words you're using, the sort of real of the words itself, and the sort of unwanted wordplay that is coming about. But what if you have the impression that there's something that doesn't fit the analytic setting as it is now? How is that distinct from the fantasy? I don't think psychoanalysis today has the concrete technical tools to give credence or to let the consequences unfold of a statement such that there is something that doesn't get to be listened to in the clinic. That statement is indistinguishable from a fantasy. And before I assume that that's a problem of the analysis, I need to at least admit the hypothesis that that's the problem of psychoanalysis. So how do we name that? How do we, at the same time, keep everything we learned from Lacan in order to localize or navigate the real in both senses, the real as this inaccessible and the real as the always parasitizing, as you mentioned, and at the same time learn how to say, okay, something in the frontier between what is significant in the clinic and what is not can shift. Of course, it won't shift inside the clinic. That's why my argument is it's neither philosophical in the sense of a general statement, nor a clinical argument. That's why I called it an institutional argument, because my impression is that it's only a certain institutional circuit which will guarantee or allow us to verify if that statement, this couldn't be heard here, is actually a consequential reformulation, representation, or I don't know how you want to call it, some change to psychoanalysis or not. So my idea is that this is not supposed to substitute the logic of the signifier. It's not supposed to praise a sort of, there is only an obstacle now because we haven't really moved forward. It's not the sort of, in communism, there will be no antagonism sort of argument. But I'm part of communist movements, and we only move forward when we have the chance of imagining how we want problems to appear. Or, I don't know, every meeting that ever supposed some equality that I've participated has been more anxiety-inducing than hierarchical meetings. Antagonism is higher, not smaller in equal settings. When I feel like I'm equal to others, I get totally anxious. It's not a pleasant experience. And we don't have concepts for that in Marxism. There is no concept, in the history I don't know of. Do you know any explanation of the corruption of a political organization that is not described as the effect of some authority structuring it? We don't have the name for the immanent problems of organizing in a more equal way, the sort of problems that you create rather than the problems that you solve. I think it's exactly the same argument. When you try to move beyond with psychoanalysis, do something new, you're going to create new problems. It's always going to be problematic, antagonistic, but it's kind of the other side of the critique that of structural antagonisms is the practical organization around them. That practical organization, it has a history. So I don't see so much a contradiction between a defense of the Lacanian position, the theory of the real in Lacan. I feel like it's just quite telling, in my opinion, that when you take this ridiculous, and I've been accused yesterday of being a vulgar materialist, and I'm starting to think that I am. I just feel like it's something to be, it's at least curious that when you take seriously the idea that the domain of psychoanalytic concepts is this ordinary artificial space, that most of the most difficult concepts of Lacan, they become ridiculously clear. I mean, you can explain, I think, why the real is at the same time inaccessible and always present. If you understand how speech was cut off from the rest of the world, you can explain the logic of the non-all and the difference with the phallic function. If you have a domain for the function. In mathematics, you don't simply talk about functions. Functions take elements from a domain, from some restricted space. When the clinical space or psychoanalysis as it exists today is taken as that domain, the opposition between either the phallic function obtains or we are in some mystical realm disappears. It still remains, as you said, all sorts of problems, antagonisms, but we get to let's say, the material basis, so to speak, of the conditions for these things to be effective becomes clearer for me. So the fact that the same thing, the same perspective clarifies the reach or the reference of these concepts, at the same time that it's allowing us to formulate the problem of antagonisms, of the real, in a way that we don't need to make that distinction between our concept of sexuality has antagonisms. Everyone else's doesn't. My position is, when I cannot listen to the way antagonism is appearing in some political discourse, it's probably I'm not listening right. I'm probably not close enough, because it will be there and people will have to deal with it somehow, right? So that's a bit the sort of, I'm trying to construct conceptual tools for us to, let's say, bear this weird moment where what comes to the public domain of very complicated struggles today might not really represent the actual struggle that goes on, without having to concede too much to what I believe to be a bit more conservative position of, which is, I think it's a classic like Kojevian position. Kojev was the guy who took, like when May 68 happened, he took up the phone, right? And he asked if anybody was dead. They said nobody was dead. And he said, so it's not a revolution. There is this realpolitik idea of, I know the hardships. The young people don't know. Let's wait for them to learn it. And I find that if we're not careful, it can be condescending. And we don't need that. I mean, it's clearly political movements are going to be complicated. And if what we are doing as Lacanians is useful, people will use it, which is what I think happened with your theory. I saw a lot of political movements abiding to Lacanian theory because it was useful to name structural antagonisms. We didn't have to go there and name it for them. So it will be a proof of our relevance if this is adopted. I don't think it's something that, it's not the best way to already organize the field, because I don't know, I think that we're already so fucked that I'd rather try something else in that sense. But I'm probably speaking already too much, and I'm not sure if I addressed the more technical.
Briefly, so that we don't, I know, if I were to be Alenka now, I would hate myself because I feel bad eating other person's time. Can I just briefly state some point and then I disappear? Daniel, you are the master. Can I do it briefly?
I think it's fine. Yeah, it's fine.
I will be brief. I promise.
5 minutes.
Promise.
5
minutes. Yeah. First, it was wonderful what Gabriel said, and with practically everything I understand, he made wonderful points about this different level of antagonism and so on and so on. What I would say is that 2 points, 2 problematic questions. We will not be able to debate them. When Gabriel, you said wonderfully, what is in psychoanalytic setting as such, the way we have it historically inherited and so on, that something cannot be heard there. And as I describe, I think in my briefly, very naively, in my foreword to your book, this happened to me repeatedly with Miller, how there was a whole level that he didn't hear. But now I will say something that probably at least you, Gabriel, I would like to defend your philosophical side from yourself, that to formulate what psychoanalysis in its, and you are right to point out, in its organizational, I hate this word, but I will, dispositive, doesn't allow to be heard, you need philosophy. This is the proper work of philosophy. Philosophy is not some stupid, philosophy precisely, these are the proper philosophical transcendental questions. Philosophy, a clinical dispositive. What doesn't it allow to see us? So here I would like, I hope you will take the joke complicate with Hegel. You know that Freud's eternal joke, mother, you know, I don't know who that woman in my dream is. I'm sure that it's not my mother. I will tell you, Gabriel, when you said that it's not, don't want to talk about Hegel, no? You are now, for your own good, practicing the same trick and answering, I don't know who I'm talking about in my reply to me, but I only know it's not Hegel, which means exactly that it was Hegel through and through. But
that's true. I take that.
You know what my answer to that wonderful Kozev anecdote would have been? You know what they should have answered him? You are dead because there are dead. You are dead, idiot Kozev. You know? Just two, three points. So many things to say. I will really try to be brief. When you pointed out very nicely how a certain basic relationship of domination and so on, even patriarchy, that Marxism, at least the way we know it, cannot do. You know, now I will do something crazy. The son of our friend Mladen Dolar, Robin Dolar, wrote now an excellent postgraduate text where he wrote, you know, maybe we should return. We tend to forget that patriarchy, sexual oppression, basic form, patriarchy, and social domination, here Engels is not, happened before class society with the passage from nomads, whatever, to Neolithic. Neolithic, with established settlements and so on, is the big break. Something happened there, sexual oppression, domination, which is ignored by Marx. Next point, I totally agree with you. It's a wonderful formula. How the point is not sex without, and the point is to deal in a different way with antagonism. And I have some examples here. For example, even for Marx, the square root of -1 was a nonsense. What mathematics did is not say, no, it's not a nonsense, it's meaningful. No, irrational number remains in some sense a nonsense, but you can deal in a totally different way with this nonsense. So maybe if you would agree, one way to intervene into sexuality is not to say harmony, blah, blah, but like the square of -1, which becomes something operative, working in a different way. Last point about non-antagonism and so on and so on. You know what, maybe I'm too harsh here, but what bothers me with some LGBT plus and so on is that nonetheless, don't you have the impression that some of them in public space, ideologists, and I think here I'm more targeting United States and developed Western countries, that they often act as if Freud didn't exist. They reproach us, oh, you are old Freudians, you don't know world exchange. But for example, this idea of demanding some kind of a certificate, signed document or a photo that both partners agree and so on, they really want to screw or whatever. But wait a minute, what if you want at the same time don't want? There are no divided subjects. The presupposition of a lot of LGBT is that you are ultimately an individual who knows what it wants. You just have to be allowed freely to express it, and then that power, perversions, and so on enters with this basically external oppression. And here they miss something that even the one whom I often criticize, Judy Butler, saw clearly, that what Freud developed so nicely is not just oppression of sexuality in the sense that you have a certain pleasures, it's prohibited, but how then you surplus enjoyment for Lacan is not, oh, I enjoy it even more. It's that you start to enjoy oppressive measures, oppression itself. It's, as Judith Butler puts it, it's a reversal of repression of desire to desire for repression and so on. And I think that something at this level gets lost, at least in the American media of LGBT+. That's why along your, Gabriel, lines, I'm always fascinated to hear about other countries. For example, I was in South Korea, unfortunately not the paradise, no. South Korea, where I debated with Me Too people there. It's a totally different Me Too than this upper middle class Me Too and so on that we are used in the West and so on and so on. So when you know what one has to be here maybe a little bit more precise. Of course, sexuality, it's even part of the usual sexual mythology, this standard antagonism, you know, like men are from Mars, women are for Venus. Obviously, it's a stupidity. I think today it's more that women are from Mars, men are from Venus, which is a good thing, and so on. But what I want to say is that...
I like that we went back to Hegel's thesis on the orbit of planets.
Yeah, no, but I will not go into that. But what I want to say is that...
2 minutes.
I will be even shorter. We both, even if me and Gabriel, even if we hate each other to death and so on, we agreed on some basic thing, which is that the big revolution is, and I think you find this already in Hegel, it's like the split from the square of minus one as something simply stupid to something that you operationalize. That this is what we should aim at, not abolish antagonisms, but make them operative in a different way. And here, just as a final provocation, I didn't yet reach 2 minutes here, but we should totally, of course, change of what we mean with philosophy. Here, something that I'm still tempted to call philosophical reflection helps. So, to attack you the last time, Gabriel, I think that here also we can say that maybe Lacan was not enough a philosopher always. Stop.
Okay, I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Slavoj, thank you very much. We wish you the best. This was incredibly rigorous, and we thank you for taking us up on our offer to do some pure theory, and everyone very honored. Very honored.
Just add one thing. It would have been, we all know, incredibly serious if we were to go on for 4 or 5 hours with Patricia and Alenka joining us and really go into all this madness. But maybe this type of really serious thing is, again, a Lacanian real that you never get.
We're going to do our best without you, but we wish you the best and thank you very much.
Don't be surprised. Maybe it's horrible for me to think this, but maybe things will get much better. I wish you this without me. Thank you very much. It was an honor for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you
and
so
Gabriel,
much.
Go on, screw them up their ass. Go on. I have to finish in a politically incorrect way, you know. Go on. It's important what you did. Just the last question should organize on. Gabriel, did you get any echoes from Millerian Lacanians already, or they still ignore it?
No, I imagine I'll get a sweet indifference as usual, but nothing, no.
Well, you know why? Imagine this: when we, the people, take power, all of Millerian Lacanians will have enough time in Gulag cell to write their memoirs and attack you further and so on. Okay. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, I leave, and it was an honor for me, seriously. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. We're going to now move to Alenka Zupančič's talk. We're very honored to have Alenka with us. She had the opportunity to listen to some of the proceedings from yesterday. Let me start by introducing Alenka to all of you. She is a Slovenian psychoanalytic theorist and philosopher. She teaches at the European Graduate School, and she's also a researcher at the Institute of Philosophy at the Slovenian Academy of Sciences and the Arts. She is the author of many books. To name a couple, a book on Nietzsche called The Shortest Shadow, Nietzsche's Philosophy of the Two, The Odd One In, and What is Sex? So today, for this panel, the title of Alenka's talk is The Concepts Supposed to Work. With that said, I'm happy to turn it over to Alenka for 40 minutes as you wish, and then we will immediately have questions.
Well, thank you. First, I really would like to say that when I wrote the blurb for Gabriel's book. And when I wrote this blurb, this endorsement, I meant every word of it. It is not by no means just a kind of a friendly publicity gesture. And I guess that this gathering, which is going on now for a second day, yes, I was able to attend the first panel yesterday, but unfortunately not the second one, so I don't know what went on there. So this gathering, I think, is in itself a great proof of the importance of this book and of its raising all the right questions and at the right moment, of course. And of course, it is also, among many things, most welcome jolt to some of the Lacanian inertia and a push to think and rethink many self-evident, obvious things that constitute Lacanian psychoanalysis. And as you know, Althusser already pointed out how self-evidence and obviousness are the hallmarks of ideology, and that ideology is somehow always ideology of the obvious. When you end up saying, okay, but how don't you get this? It's obvious, it's usually precisely there that some kind of ideological theme comes in. And of course, Gabriel reactivated this motive when speaking of Lacanian ideology and of some of the rather disastrous effects that the latter can have in terms of its social and political positioning, but also in terms of its conceptual life, let's say. So I'm extremely glad to be part of this event, which looks as the site of some serious and genuine comradely discussion of many nagging issues that demand or should demand our attention. So I understand Tupinamba's principal aim, which is to establish this kind of a regional value of psychoanalysis and see how it enters into a relationship of composability with other fields of thought. I understand this aim as an effort to force, to make psychoanalysis recognize that it is being part of the social and physical world rather than its smart-ass, arrogant, knows-it-all supplement. Or at best, to function as a path of subjective emancipation open to those who can afford it economically. So obviously the whole discussion of money and of how it functions in psychoanalysis, and that probably it functions not so very differently from how it functions in other configurations, is extremely important. And it is important socially, but also because I think it is a rather clear-cut example of how psychoanalytic thinking itself can fall prey to its own too quick understanding of how psychoanalysis works and what it is. And this understanding involves the proposition that there is always another truer meaning to what is said in analysis than, let's say, the obvious one. So if I say I don't have money to pay you, you can never mean just that. But this is immediately taken as involving some transference troubles, which it could, but the other aspect cannot simply be made disappear. And I think that this kind of claustrophobic hermeneutics is even in any kind of tune with Lacanian psychoanalysis, because it fails precisely to do what Lacan was for him was the most important thing, namely to hear what is being said rather than what you presuppose is being said or what is there already in this sense, the presuppositions. Okay. So there is also, I think, an interesting sub-question to these economic issues related to psychoanalytic treatment, which prevents the interrogation from sliding into simply humanitarian waters in the sense of we'll do it pro bono or something like this, and which also relates to the title of Gabriel's book. Namely, this question, is there something like popular desire for psychoanalysis? Does it exist, or do we desire it existed? And from what I gather from the comments by Gabriel and David and so on, it seems that in Brazil, there is this popular demand, which is surely something good. But it's important to see that it is not only a question of money and who can afford it, although this is obviously a huge and dramatic question, but also is there even desire for it among the so-called less privileged classes. So in any case, I think there is a great merit in Gabriel's idea that, if I put it very bluntly, in order to make psychoanalysis universally appealing, one should first acknowledge its restrictions and limitations, provided with a kind of delimited space, and then let it engage from there with the rest of the world. But I nevertheless feel that an important dimension of psychoanalysis could get lost in some ways of, at least some ways of understanding this suggestion, and particularly when it comes to the conceptual range and power of psychoanalysis. And I think in my talk, I will kind of reiterate in my way a few points that Slavoj already made. I think there is not much surprise in the fact that we share quite some specific points in this respect. So a lot of emphasis is put in the book on what Gabriel calls these improper generalizations, and then of course fetishism of the signifier, structural dialectics as related to the logic of the signifier, all of which would need to be, I simplify a little bit, but would need to be kind of dismantled and regionalized to rediscover the real core of psychoanalysis, or to get rid at least of the psychoanalytic ideology. Well, these are very complex questions, and Tupinambá certainly treats them as such, which one can hardly do in the format of one talk. So I will just limit myself to pointing out and briefly developing some questions and arguments which are not, I certainly hope this much will be clear, meant as a defense of the Lacanian ideology and its master signifiers, but rather as a defense of a certain philosophical or ontological dimension of psychoanalysis, which I believe has always been there. And I think, moreover, that it is good that it has always been there. So I will start by first saying something about what could it mean to be or to declare oneself a Lacanian philosopher, as some of us do. Then I will move on just to a few concrete theoretical points that I feel kind of compelled to make, also to some extent in response to Gabriel's implicit and friendly polemics relating also at some points to my, but not only my work, particularly the issues concerning the theory of the signifier as an improper generalization and the distinction between naming and instituting a new axiom, a distinction which revolves in Gabriel's discussion around the Cantorian notion of actual infinity, so the problem of infinity that we've already touched a little bit in the previous discussion after Slavoj's talk. So if I feel compelled to intervene at this point, it is not because I think my take on them is flawless and not begging itself some serious further questions, but because it certainly does. I feel simply passionate about these issues and their implications, so I would like to seize this opportunity to kind of further pursue them and discuss them with Gabriel. So first, this question. What is this when one says I'm a Lacanian philosopher? What is this strange appellation which seems more and more likely to provoke indignation and contempt among many clinical Lacanians and certainly, of course, among Millerians? As if Lacanian philosophy would amount to amputating the clinical experience and turning psychoanalysis simply into a kind of Weltanschauung. And the strife between clinical and non-clinical Lacanians, or Lacanian clinic and Lacanian theory, has been most productively displaced precisely by Tupinambá by adding a third term to debate here. This organization and the question of psychoanalytic institutions as autonomous also in their epistemological function. So something third. But I also think that the question of philosophy in its relationship to psychoanalysis cannot be assimilated by the divide clinic theory or metapsychology and simply placed on the side of theory. I think something else and more complex and more important even is going on here. And okay, this is a kind of audacious proposal, but I would be almost tempted to say that Lacanian philosophy is a kind of, or has functioned, at least for some time, as a kind of Lacanian institution in the sense that Gabriel gives to this term. A way in which psychoanalytic theory and clinic live in a third term and aims at some kind of universal address. I'm obviously not suggesting that this philosophy should or could replace psychoanalytic institutions proper, but in view of Tupinambá's analysis of the failure of these institutions in the past decades, could we not say, considering their social and political effects, that philosophy has taken place of them to some extent? And I'm thinking here, obviously, particularly of Slavoj, whose popularization in the best sense of the term of Lacan and his ideas has, I think, little, if any, competition in psychoanalytic institutions. We could say, indeed, that at a certain point, philosophy, also with this political dimension, has come to rescue of Lacanian psychoanalysis, much in the same way in which Lacan has come to the rescue of philosophy at some critical points when everybody, including most philosophers, was eager to distance themselves from philosophy as metaphysics and from notions such as subject, truth, and so on. I've always found this double rescue, this rather unexpected complicity, fascinating, productive, and pregnant with implications. And I will mention some of the instances also later on. So I think the affair between philosophy and psychoanalysis is a rather singular one, or exceptional one. I don't think philosophy is simply one of the many partners of psychoanalysis, or simply there in its theoretical part. There is something a little bit more twisted and interesting here. And perhaps we could say that, like a proper love story, it is a non-relationship that works, actually works. Okay, so to return to my question, what does it mean to say something like I'm a Lacanian philosopher? Since Lacan was not, at least not primarily a philosopher, it cannot mean the same thing as when one says I'm a Hegelian or Kantian or whatever Spinozist philosopher. It is also not, I claim, an appropriation of some central Lacanian concepts on the grounds of philosophy, or a description of a kind of, which has a kind of psychoanalytic coloring, a philosophy that has a kind of psychoanalytic coloring. It is more, I would say that it is perhaps in itself a philosophical proposition, even thesis. It says there is a properly philosophical dimension of the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. As I said earlier, this philosophical dimension of Lacan is not simply the same as theoretical or meta-psychological side of his work as existing besides or beyond the clinical realm and besides the institutional realm. It is also there in the very way in which he raises certain questions. What is meant so by philosophical dimension of Lacan's work, perhaps it's simply this: a new thought is produced in a conceptual form, a thought, moreover, that does not shy away from the idea, pardon, of truth, and involved in a significant and is involved in the significant work of conceptual construction. But more importantly, as I said, and I will come to this with an example, it is very much there in the way certain, or even not only in the way certain questions are asked, but in the fact that certain questions are asked, which is not self-evident. So it also, I think, Lacanian, the philosophical dimension has produced concepts that work, not only inside, but also outside of psychoanalytic setting. And that this thought and its thinking was produced in relation to clinical setting is neither a limitation nor a mark of its exclusiveness. And here you can see I divert a little bit from Tupinambá, who argues that it is a limitation, although a positive one, like constituting a psychoanalytic field. The question is, of course, open to debate, and there are many facets of it. For example, I very much agree and support the thesis that the universal dimension or value of the Lacanian theory misfires completely or is not even there when it serves as a ground for a certain attitude of superiority and exclusivity. What we encounter here in this attitude is a double move that actually involves, I would say, cheating. Namely, the universal dimension or validity of psychoanalytic theory is seen in this attitude as inseparably bound to the singular and exclusive point of its origin, clinical origin. Not only is the clinical origin not perceived as a limitation, it is perceived as a guarantee of truth, as a privileged access to truth with which one cannot argue, especially when one is not herself a clinician. So I've encountered psychoanalysts who were very happy to be involved in broader debates with philosophers on all kinds of issues. But then when some of their conceptual conclusions or claims were challenged, instead of attempting to further convincingly argue their points on the conceptual level, accessible to everybody present, they suddenly took recourse to their clinical experience as the ultimate ace up their sleeve, that is, as providing them with an a priori higher authority in the general debate. And this is what I call cheating, or if one prefers, disavowing the universal conceptual dimension of psychoanalysis while clinging to its universal validity as grounded in the singular origin of its claims. So, to be sure, I'm not claiming that experience as point of origin is irrelevant. I'm simply saying that this is not how conceptual truth operates. It operates, and psychoanalysis has some quite valid conceptual truths to exchange. So it operates with no specific privileges for the possessors of the Holy Grail, so to say. In fact, conceptual truth perhaps bears some similarities to the idea of the past, also discussed in Gabriel's book. Even if originating in a singular experience, the knowledge and truth related to this experience must become independent of it and kind of universally accessible. So the way I understand this is not that what gets transmitted in this way conceptually or in the past needs to be cut off from the real involved in its production, but rather that this real itself gets transmitted, that it becomes in a way part of the concept that works, so to say. And of course, we can say that when this happens, when it is transmitted or said, what is proposed is much more convincing usually than when this doesn't happen. On the other hand, it is quite true that a lot of truly non-compelling empty talk is constantly being produced both inside and outside of psychoanalytic experience. Okay, but let me return to Tupinamba's argument concerning the limitation and regional character of psychoanalytic concepts. It is true that the clinical setting is here, I'm in a way reiterating what already Slavoj was saying. It is true that clinical setting is a very singular setting. And one of Gabriel's main arguments consists in suggesting that no general theory of the signifier can follow from it because of the way in which the signifying order functions within this setting, starting and relating to the rule of free associations. Because this is so, that it cannot follow because this field is so specific that it shouldn't allow for an extrapolation or generalization. I think this is a serious and very important question, and I have some reservation also concerning the verdict. And I'm not talking specifically of the Miller-Badiou debate concerning Frege, which is very, very greatly discussed in the book, and I completely agree that one can decide one way or another, but surely I don't think one can accuse Badiou here of not being on the side of certain universal value of what is, or general value even, of what is being argued in the philosophical sense. So to begin with, I think there is a structure of kind of mutual implication or mutual accusation even at work at the origin of psychoanalysis, as perhaps at the origin of at the origin as such, and the very notion of origin. There is no linear way of beginning, so to say. Psychoanalysis didn't start by first establishing this singular setting, or perhaps I should say that it did not start there in this setting for no reason, just because of a Freud's whim. Couldn't we say that Freud came up with this setting based on what he perceived as a general future, or intuited as a general feature of human speech, not future, but feature of human speech, and functioning of words, which included, of course, slips of the tongue, jokes, and of course, dreams. The intuition, at least, was there, was that there is something that words inevitably and irreducibly carry with them, and that this something can neither be simply eliminated or just isolated independently of these words themselves, but it can be brought out and articulated, influenced, even changed in this singular setting and its rules, and not simply some substance, but also the real, in the sense of the antagonism of these things, that in the sense that we were discussing this notion before, and that also Gabriel uses it. So talking cure can work because words are not just words, precisely. It's not just talk. So I think one needs at least to ask this naive question: if the word did not function the way described by the general theory of the signifier, were it even possible for the clinical setting to function as it does, to set up its specific way of working with that? So although I can agree that speech functions differently within the confines of a clinical setting than outside it, this, I think, does not preclude the question, what is it in speech in general that allows for this singular functioning of speech in analysis? And this kind of questions is precisely the questions that philosophy asks. And this is what I call the philosophical dimension of Lacan, which is not the same thing, I claim, as Lacanian ideology, which certainly also exists. Moreover, and perhaps surprisingly, it is precisely here in this question of this singular method, so to say, of free association, this singular setting, that, at least according to Lacan, the theory of the signifier binds with being, or the question of being, as I will try to show in a moment. This is why Lacan links the Freudian method to the Cartesian method, which is a kind of a very interesting connection. Okay, so I'm the first to agree that there has been a lot of boring, jargonizing, empty usage of the notions such as logic of the signifier, with this term functioning as a kind of fetish, in the sense that Badiou claims that the word democracy is mostly used today as a fetish, or also as a filler, a stopgap, rather than a conceptual working space. Very often it gets lifted as a screen that stops any further thought or discussion, with the also frequent implication that if you don't know what exactly this means or involves, you cannot partake in the discussion. But as I think also Tupinambá rightfully suggests, this is more often even a problem of Lacanian psychoanalysts than a problem of Lacanian philosophers, although it surely exists among philosophers as well. So I think Tupinambá is very right to raise this question. Why is it so hard, he says, for us to speak to other thinkers in their own language? And to relate this to my earlier point, I would add that it was precisely because he was able to discuss these concepts in other people's languages that Žižek is probably the most responsible for the kind of global spreading of the Lacanian ideas. But speaking other languages does not simply mean, in this case, I think, to translate one concept into another, from another field. It also doesn't mean to drop or replace it. It rather means to kind of develop and exemplify a specific concept in terms that invite and even force further thinking, produce it rather than close it off behind the suggestion we all know or should know what this means. So adhering to a concept, not letting go of it, implies that one is able to make it work, to show how it helps us understand certain relations better than without that concept, or even that it only makes it possible for us to think of certain relations that were certainly there already before, but we were not able to think them and to properly include them in these configurations. And I like this example of class struggle as a Marxian concept that actually named something, but this naming was not just a naming of an impasse which remains within the confines of the previous configuration, because it names something, some negativity, some antagonism that adds a new element in this, which was present there only in this negative way. Antagonism gets articulated differently, and this then does change, I would say, the rules of the game, or the way we think and discuss conceptually the social space. Okay, so I will skip here a bit because. So I guess my point would be simply this: the argument in favor of the regional character of psychoanalysis, which allows for its composability with other fields of thought, does not necessarily imply regional validity of its key concepts. And perhaps this is not even Tupinambá's point, since he mostly confines this objection to one concept, that of the signifier. But of course, this concept is clearly at work in all of the so-called fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, so it remains kind of unclear what its dismissal or limitation on the general level would imply for these concepts, for example, for the concepts of the unconscious. So what I would like to again return to and point out at this stage is this kind of fascinating for me, forceful alliance between philosophy and Lacanian psychoanalysis when it comes to the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. This is clearly what attracts me in Lacan, and I'm not judging the implications of this for the clinical psychoanalysis. Perhaps they are, I don't know, bad or whatever, but this is not what I'm discussing here. So with the notable exception of the drive, which he develops mostly through reading of Freud, the other three concepts are developed by Lacan with explicit reference to philosophy. And reference is too weak a term here. He develops them by situating them in a clear philosophical, direct philosophical lineage. For transference, you have Plato. For repetition, you have Symposium. For repetition, you have Aristotle, TK, and Automaton, and Kierkegaard. And most prominently and most fascinatingly, for the unconscious, you have Descartes and his cogito. And the later is probably the most surprising and ingenious connection, but really also, I think, a quite essential one. After starting with Nietzsche and Heidegger, and to some extent already with Kant, contemporary philosophy has largely turned away from the founder of rationalist metaphysics, Descartes. A prominent psychoanalyst turns to the Cartesian cogito of all concepts in order to validate and demonstrate the Freudian hypothesis of the unconscious. And in clear difference to some other modern approaches, which would read the unconscious or madness as kind of the other repressed side of the cogito, Lacan takes it to constitute itself the very subject of the unconscious, the Freudian subject, as he calls it. So let me read you two quotes, one very short, in the other a little bit longer, but I think very interesting. So the first quote from the four fundamental concepts: I dare to state as a truth that the Freudian field was possible only in a certain time after the emergence of the Cartesian subject. And the second point, the second quote, this makes it clear that in the term subject, I'm not designating the living substratum needed by this phenomena of the subject, nor any sort of substance, nor any being possessing knowledge in his pathos, his suffering, nor even some incarnated logos, but the Cartesian subject who appears at the moment when doubt is recognized as certainty. Except that, through my approach, the basis of the subject proved to be wider, but at the same time, much more amenable to the certainty that eludes it. This is what the unconscious is. You see, okay, it's a dense quote, but I think, and I will try to unpack it a little bit, the basic idea is clear enough. So these are very strong statements, and they show how Lacan is not only in a constant dialogue with philosophy, but that this dialogue is or presents itself as absolutely immanent, inherent to the philosophical concepts he develops, to the psychoanalytic concepts he develops, that it belongs to their basic texture. So Lacan is not situating his concept of the unconscious in a relationship to the Cartesian cogito, but there is this stronger claim. He sees it as an inherent kind of working extension of this notion itself. So, as you know, Cartesian subject emerges at the point where doubt flips into certainty after bracketing all content and only with this thought of doubt remaining. So this happens when we disregard all content of particular thoughts and focus on the persistence of thinking as such. And then obviously for Descartes, the way to kind of access the world again, to expand and solidify this fleeting punctuality, this point of the subject is via the recourse to the supposition of the truthful God, who guarantees for the existence and permanence of truths, even when we are not thinking about them or doubting them. So, and Lacan proposes something else, but directly related to this, namely he believes that he or Freud has found a more immanent way to sustain being as a form of extension of doubt. The way to expand and to give some consistency to this fleeting, pulsating punctuality is by recognizing how doubt is not simply an operation performed on different thoughts, but is part of these thoughts themselves. Inseparable for them, has a materiality there, providing them with some amount of certainty. This is what he calls also a famous expression, the Colophon of Doubt, as a means of analytic certainty. And he goes even so as far as to suggest that the rule of free association is actually Freud reinventing the Cartesian method. So please pardon me for reading one more passage from Lacan, but I really find this very interesting also in relationship to the whole debate that we are having here. So Descartes, this is the quote, Descartes apprehends his I think in the enunciation of the I doubt, not in its statement, which still bears all of this knowledge to be put in doubt. So, you know, I doubt this and this as this, but the fact is that I doubt, I think in this doubt is a thought, therefore I am. Okay, so to continue with the quote, shall I say that Freud makes one more step, which designates for us sufficiently the legitimacy of our association between Freud and Descartes. When he invites Freud as to integrate in the text of the dream what I shall call the Colophon of Doubt. The Colophon is an old text. In an old text is a small pointing hand that used to be printed in the days when we still had a typography in the margin. The Colophon of Doubt is part of the text. This indicates that Freud places certainly his Gewissheit only in the constellation of the signifiers as they result from recounting the commentary, the association, even if they are later retracted. Everything provides a signifying material, which is what he depends on to establish his own Gewissheit. For I stress that the experience begins only with this method. This is why I compare it to the Cartesian method. Okay, this was the quote. So you see, there is this moment in Descartes when a radical doubt, the thinking flips into being as kind of this certitude of thinking. Similarly, Lacan suggests the Freudian method of free associations and other forms of reiterating in analysis, in analytical setting, introduces something of the subject's being in the midst of this free-running, whatever signifying chains. And by reiterating this, listening to this, one can establish something. One can hear something, one can establish something. And this something is not simply there only in psychoanalysis. It is something that has relevance also outside of this setting. And we could say perhaps that the Cartesian method of hyperbolic doubt is a singular artificial method, of course, but I don't think this limits philosophically the validity of Descartes' conclusions at this point. We can say, okay, Descartes is all wrong, but I don't think this is about limitation of the validity of this method or its capacity to make general claims because of the singular way in which it was produced. So Lacan further adds that Freud did not induce the subject into the world. Descartes did this. What Freud does is that he addresses, he says, this subject in order to say to him, here in the field of the dream, you are at home. So you dream, therefore you are. Not in the romantic or metaphorical sense of the term dream, like you are alive till you can hang on to a dream, but in the literal sense of dreams, including nightmares, constituting the field where a certain inherent impossibility gets to be encountered. So dreams and other unconscious formations are interesting because far from being the realm of the purely subjective, pointing to this or that pathology as truth of the subject, they rather point out with their sheer existence that subject itself is the truth or proof of a real. In other words, coming after Descartes, Freud doesn't need to prove that subject exists. What he indicates is that the existence of the subject itself is the proof of a real, of something that is not reducible to or derivable from simply the subject itself. So if there is a dream, a slip of the tongue, a joke, there is subject. Why? Because subject is not simply an effect of discourse, as postmodern doxa would have it. Subject is not an effect of structure. Subject is the lack, the gap in this structure. Subject is different from subjectivation as this kind of richness of life experience. And this is an important point. I know I won't have time to go into this because it also influences very much this double positioning of the subject of subjectivity as the, for instance, if we talk about repression, Verdrängung, this implies that a subject is not simply this as ontological lack or inconsistency of the symbolic or discursive order. Subject is not only or simply the agent of repression, but also, and perhaps in the first place, the place where repression happens. The very point, the problematic point in the structure where it happens. So this is what this notion of the subject also indicates. So now I don't know, do I still have like 5 minutes or I'm already over my, I just wanted briefly to address this question of infinity, but
go ahead. We're going to go, and when you're done, we'll go immediately to Patricia, and then when she's done, we'll do Q&A for both. So take a few minutes. It's okay.
Okay. So it is this question, because this is related to what I have been saying. Actual infinity, the way Lacan seems to be reluctant to accept it. And again, it's a very complex discussion. I'm ill-equipped for it because my knowledge of counter and mastery of mathematics is actually limited to Badiou's and Tupinamba's presentations of it. But just a few points that kind of strike me from a Lacanian or perhaps Hegelian perspective. First, this question of the beyond, of the outside that allegedly haunts Lacan's position. And Slavoj was already talking about this a little bit. This inaccessible, unattainable otherness and outsideness and so on. Here, I would say 3 things. Okay, the first thing, I don't need to say it because Slavoj already developed it to some extent, pointing out how the feminine side of sexuation is kind of about there is no exception, there is no outside, there is no, this is precisely what kind of infinitizes it. So I want to repeat this argument. Second, I think if you remember Lacan's famous comment on this paradox of Achilles and tortoise, I think it is a very good way of understanding his take on inaccessibility. You know, the paradox goes like this: Achilles can never catch up with the tortoise because when he makes one step, tortoise also makes one step, and so there is this infinite space that is created between them. So you have infinity which can never be accomplished or actualized. So Lacan's comment here is this: true, Achilles can never catch up with the tortoise, but he can overtake it with the first step. So the problem with accessibility is not, and I think this is important, is not that there is something which eludes us and that we can never quite attain because of this or that limitation, but rather that there is something inaccessible in the very act of attaining. So it is, and this is also, I think, what the famous non-relation is all about. So it is also relates to this point that Slavoj was making, that the real is impossible in itself, not only in this vis-a-vis our approaching it. Second, I think that Lacan's point is not to axiomatically affirm the infinite, it is rather a Hegelian move of passing from bad to true infinity by negating or abandoning any exception to finitude. So I can see the difference between this position and Cantor's, and I can see, I think, the merits and the revolution that Cantor's institution of a new axiom brings to mathematics and to its practicing. But I'm not sure, or I have some problems conceiving how can this be simply exported to psychoanalysis without remaining a purely abstract claim or kind of a formal, just a formal operator or guarantor of the existence of other possibilities, and that but something that only affirms the existence of other possibilities rather than actually introducing any other possibilities, as Cantor axiom clearly does. So, you know, in this difference, and here I will really, I don't know if I even go on this opposition proposed by Tupinambá between naming and bringing out the impasse of formalization, which kind of stays within the confines of what is already there, and this axiomatic proposition of something new, which Cantor was in position to accomplish. What I find problematic is this. Okay, with Cantor, I'm quite ready to accept that this happens because of this concept. Cantor, I quote Tupinambá, was able to show that a series of new rules, problems, and structures follow from the novelties that would follow from applying unions, exponentiations, correspondence, other operations to infinite sense. So something happens here. But I'm afraid that to repeat this in psychoanalysis in this form does not amount to any of that, but remains a kind of declaration or affirmation of possibility, instance of possibility of castration functioning in other ways, or which probably the phrase, the formulation that strikes me as a little bit problematic is this one. I quote Gabriel again: actual infinity marks in our new meta-psychological model the place of still unknown ways the castration might operate. Well, I'm not sure if it's clear what I mean. I think that, to put it very bluntly, in the Cantor's case, the axiomatic assertion is already the new thing itself. It is the creation of the possibilities. Whereas the way I think this is constructed here, it's like in psychoanalysis, it remains a tenons-lieu, a marker of some future possibility or unknown things or so on. So, but in this way, I don't think it says much more than radical change is possible. Obviously, other things are possible, but so I think there is a certain problem here, a certain shift that takes place, but I understand the whole implication, the whole bill that is there in Tupinambá to precisely distinguish between things that are completely unproductive and revolve around what is already known and things which allow for this. But there is perhaps a problem. So I will stop here. Basically, the only and the main thing that I wanted to point out in this perspective so greatly opened by Gabriel's book is that it is probably important not to let go of an important inherent philosophical dimension of Lacan in the name of getting rid of the Lacanian theology. Okay, I'm sorry, I was a little bit too long. I apologize.
That's wonderful, Alenka. Thank you for that very challenging and thought-provoking presentation. Gabriel, make a note of the various points you wish to address. We will address them after Patricia's presentation. But yes, it's been an honor to have you, Alenka. So now let me happily introduce our final speaker for this panel, Patricia Gherovici. She is a psychoanalyst, an analytic supervisor, and recipient of the 2020 Sigourney Award for her clinical and scholarly work with Latinx and gender variant communities. Patricia is co-founder and director of the Philadelphia Lacan Group, associate faculty psychoanalytic studies minor at the University of Pennsylvania, an honorary member at the Institute of Psychoanalytic Training and Research in New York City, and a founding member of Das Unbehagen. Her single-authored books include the Puerto Rican Syndrome that won the Gradiva Award and the Boyer Prize, as well as Please Select Your Gender, From the Invention of Hysteria to the Democratizing of Transgenderism, and Transgender Psychoanalysis, a Lacanian perspective on sexual difference. So, Patricia, first and foremost, thank you for being with us. It's an honor to have you and welcome you to this symposium. Continue online to use Desire of Psychoanalysis on Twitter for any kind of comments or statements, questions, etc. Again, in the spirit of tracking some theoretical issues that emerge here, we hope to have future events, given that not all of your questions will be answered, but also pose your questions and we'll do our best. With that said, please.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm very, very happy to be able to participate in this wonderful event. I watched it yesterday on Facebook. I was able to follow most of the presentations and to maybe render and use the capabilities of a Zoom. I will indulge in show and tell, and I recommend to everybody the book. It's an excellent book that is an urgent read, and it becomes more current on a daily basis. So please take a look at Gabriel Tupinambá's book. And with that, I will start my response to the book, because it elicits a lot of thinking. It's a book that really often use this word thought-provoking, but this is actually a book that one is constantly dialoguing in one's mind with every idea developing. There are many ideas in every page, so it's a very stimulating book. My point of departure for this book that poses excellent questions, as Gabriel was saying earlier, is I think many cannot be so easily answered, but I think it's something extremely important to start posing a good questions. I try to respond, or maybe I could open other questions that these questions bring up for me, based on my own theory of practice. Needless to say, my point of view is quite different, because I am not a philosopher, I am a psychoanalyst. Or maybe I should rephrase that, and I would say that I am something that I started saying at the time when there was a big discussion about the licensing of psychoanalysts in New York State, where psychoanalysts were required to have a license to practice. And I started to define my work as that of a practitioner of the unconscious. And this may sound a little cult or religion-like, but defines in broad terms what one needs to keep in mind as a Lacanian and fully licensed psychoanalyst. I do not share all of Tupinambá's critical statements about the economy of psychoanalysis, or even the links between theory and practice, but I follow his drift in his indictment of Millerian attempts to enlist psychoanalysis in political crusades that render conflict belonging to a school and voting for a certain presidential candidate. Could one imagine anyone in the American Psychoanalytic Association asking their members not to vote for Trump or Biden? My own politicization of psychoanalysis took a different turn because it was marked by exile. I grew up during a dictatorship. I lost a few friends to the torturers of the so-called dirty war against anybody who could have books by Marx of Althusser. I also saw the explosive expansion of Lacanism precisely at that time. Is something that continues to baffle me. When I left Argentina, where I was born and raised, my Lacanian friends warned me, forget about the idea of practicing as an analyst in the United States. Their psychoanalysis has long been dead. It has been killed decades ago. As Theodor Adorno once quipped, in psychoanalysis, nothing is true but exaggerations. First, let me give you some context for such a dire warning. I was living behind Buenos Aires, the so-called capital of psychoanalysis. In fact, Argentina has the highest ratio of psychoanalysts per capita in the world. But it's not only a center for psychoanalysis, it's also a great center for Lacanism. And today, there are more Lacanians in Buenos Aires than in Paris. I don't know about the numbers in Brazil. I would like to hear if you can give me an update. But we can see that Buenos Aires is perhaps a good experiment, to use that word, where we can compare the cultural presence of psychoanalysis, very different from the cultural influence of psychoanalysis in the United States, where it's clearly in decline. In general, in Latin America, psychoanalysis is, we may say, flourishing, and particularly because it has a political aspect that is somehow forgotten or developed differently in the North American context. In Argentina, which is the example I know most, the influence of psychoanalysis is great, and its adoption as a clinical practice, as be it as an analyst or as an analysand, is never a stigma. Everyone does it, rich and poor. Most health insurance cover multiple sessions a year, and many psychoanalytic clinics work in state-run hospitals, are free. So psychoanalysis manages to serve the working classes in a way fulfilling an old wish of Freud, that is Freud's commitment to the treatment of the poor, as beautifully documented by Elizabeth Danto's 2007 book, Freud's Free Clinic, Psychoanalysis and Social Justice, 1918-1938. So this commitment of psychoanalysis for the people, a chapter in the history of psychoanalysis that is forgotten in the social memory and also in the memory of psychoanalysts themselves, is still kept well and alive. Very, very different from the fate of psychoanalysis in the United States, where it has developed as a lucrative medical subspecialty, which has brought along the idea that it was a practice reserved for the elites. I left Argentina with my friend's gloomy piece of advice about the poverty of American psychoanalysis and arrived in the US in the midst of the so-called Freud wars, and where calls to bury Freud were heard everywhere. My clinical practice as a psychoanalyst in North Philadelphia's barrio was pointing to a very different situation for psychoanalysis. There, the Anitas, Margaritas, Socorros, Marias, and Joses were having ataques de nervios or hysteric symptoms of yesteryears that were showing me that psychoanalysis was not only needed, but reinvented every day in the barrio. Coming from a Latin American nation commonly said to be in development, I was hoping to find in the US a better lifestyle and health. And what I witnessed was a reverse American dream. The third world was right there in the middle of the US mainland. Feeling marginal as a double minority, I was an immigrant, I was a psychoanalyst, and top of all, I was a Lacanian psychoanalyst. I found myself working in the middle of a much more disenfranchised community. In the US, most psychoanalysts have sustained the belief that psychoanalysis is neutral, apolitical, close to the medical model, and supposedly immune to the pressures of history. In Argentina, on the contrary, psychoanalysis was considered a politically engaged practice, even a dangerous one. During the 1970s and 1980s military dictatorships, psychoanalysis became one of the main targets of state terror persecution. In an infamous speech, one of the orators of the military junta, Admiral Macera, denounced Marx, of course, Einstein, of course, but also Freud as one of the greatest enemies of Western civilization. Military ideologues believed that psychoanalysis could destroy the Christian concept of the family, and as a result, a big number of students of psychoanalysis and psychoanalysts themselves were disappeared, kidnapped, tortured, and assassinated, and many others forced into exile. Given this background, it was obvious for me that to work clinically with poor and disenfranchised minority people in the barrio implied taking a political position that was linked to my awareness that the poor are poor, but can't afford to have an unconscious. My clinical position, therefore, could not be maintaining the illusion of an apolitical vacuum. However, the idea of the neutrality of the psychoanalyst persists today, as mentioned yesterday by David Pau Cuellar. Here in the US, there has been a recent change after the 2016 presidential election results, where many psychoanalysts started expressing political views on several online forums. And they were severely reprimanded and censored by the institutes in the name of maintaining scientific neutrality. And also not to upset the analysts who may find out that their analyst does not share their political views. They have a point here, and I will add that I will not refuse myself an analyst because they voted for a candidate I don't like. But I think to be a psychoanalyst entails a practice of neutrality, but not as a citizen, but limited to the confines of the office. Here I agree with Tupinambá's original remark that Lacan has defined in 1936 already in Beyond the Reality Principle, that the fact that the clinical setting is a real space that is split off from reality. It does not mean that it's a pure artifice, but at least two determinations remain real: money and time. If within the unreal reality, an analyst praises Trump or Biden for that matter, while I'm listening in session, this has to be treated as a symptom. What does not react to a symptom as a militant facing an enemy. However, reality exists even if this means that it's both social and divided. And constructed as well. I discovered this simple fact by doing clinical work in Philadelphia's barrio, a place that looked continuous with the rest of the city, but was in fact a different world with different rules, and of course a different language, in this case, Spanglish. There, the parallel economy of drug traffic imposes a code of honor that is quite specific. For instance, one day one of our receptionists got her car stolen, and she quickly called on the phone an uncle, and the news got very fast around the neighborhood. Soon after, her car was found with the thief still at the wheel. He was dragged out and beaten up by the drug dealers at the corner. A receptionist had to plead to avoid his execution. This shows that the parallel economy recognized that we were doing work for the community and had earned the recognition. Nothing was ever asked in return, I have to add. In this context, I was able to see how psychoanalysis can be effectively conducted in settings that are not considered quote unquote traditional. My experience in the barrio led me to conclude that in the United States, psychoanalytic practice has segregated itself, ghettoized itself within the confines of the upper classes. At the other end of the social spectrum, we face people who have been treated as objects by the system. It was crucial to welcome them in a space in which they could become subjects. I have tried to demonstrate this in my book, The Puerto Rican Syndrome. For instance, there I analyzed the story of a woman who had been shot in the head during a random holdup and managed to overcome her trauma when she could utter a sentence in which she spoke in the first person, assuming a new agency as a grammatical subject. My practice was in a community mental health center in the so-called Golden Block or Bloque de Oro. Small and decrepit, the building had been a funeral home at better times. My ample consulting room with his elaborate flower carvings on the wall, paneling on the walls, was the room where the lounge where the caskets were displayed for visitation. And this office did not have an analytic couch, but I had enough space to recreate a sort of Freudian stage and would sit up with the desk behind me. And my clients, as we were asked to call the people we serve using a term that offered them illusory empowerment as economic agents because healthcare is a business like any other. They were provided with better chairs, and we were somehow avoiding the face-to-face model of interpersonal relationship. To say that that neighborhood was tough is an understatement. On a daily basis, one of my patients would report a crime-related death. There was once a drive-by shooting in the middle of the day, right under my office window. And from time to time, while watering the plants in the office, I would think of the rows of wooden coffins that had been laid in that same room for viewing for the last goodbye. From the exterior, it was hard for passerbys to guess what happened in the clinic. There was a small sign that read Centro de Servicios para Hispanos, not specifying what kind of services we were offering. The famous Bloque de Oro is a busy street full of stores, double parked cars, and trucks covered in graffiti. There was pedestrian traffic, something that was a rare occurrence in the barrio because walking was considered dangerous. And the sidewalks now stand with Krayak vials had been painted with yellow swirls to hint at the American dream of gold-paved success. In the barrio fast food shops, customers are served behind bullet-proof acrylic partitions. But right there in the same location, just opposite our clinic, there was the Taller Puertorriqueño, known as the El Corazón Cultural del Barrio, the cultural heart of Latinx Philadelphia, an organization, an art organization, cultural art organization operating since 1974. This nonprofit organization organized art exhibits, book readings, and events that engage the community and embrace the barrio's cultural heritage. It promotes community empowerment, social justice, and equality through art and educational programs, and has a fantastic bookstore with an excellent selection of bilingual books, jewelry and arts by Puerto Rican artists and Latinx artists throughout the diaspora. In this bustle in the Bloque de Oro, hair salons, pork butchers, bodegas, restaurants of criolla food, there were several botanicas selling spiritualism and Santeria material. And in fact, our patients would come only after unsuccessfully tried libation, prayers, candles, and a wide variety of herbs and roots in spells and rituals. Was guided by my barrio patients who had ataque de nervios that I discovered something called the Puerto Rican syndrome, a diagnosis invented by the US Army doctors that is still appearing in the DSM today, this Bible of psychiatric diagnosis. Puerto Rican soldiers coming from the Korean War were suffering from supposedly mysterious symptoms for which psychiatric knowledge could offer no explanation or treatment. The manifestations look like a form of pseudo-epilepsy and range from rage to catatonia, a sort of convulsive attack that happened to be an exact repetition of the most classical form of hysteria, one long considered eradicated. This recalcitrant bodily symptoms was identical, this cluster of symptoms, identical to those who guided Freud in the creation of psychoanalysis and allowed for the original discovery of the unconscious. This clearly racist label, Puerto Rican syndrome, is also could be taken also as an allegory of a paradoxical position of colonial subjects, where each individual symptom could become an allegory of a social situation. This is a manifestation that is clearly both political and clinical at the same time, and send us back to Freud's momentous discovery of the unconscious in the context of the interpretation of dreams. There in the interpretation of dreams, there is one specific dream where the Spanish-American War, the war that consolidated the United States imperial ambitions, appears in Freud's unconscious. This is where we see a political dream that echoes with the cultural politics of the barrio. It's called the Castle by the Sea dream, and it's a dream of Freud about the Spanish-American War, the one that ended with the annexation of Puerto Rico. We see how the unconscious is traversed by politics or by at the time, current news about imperialist wars. I don't have time today to explore this dream, as I have done in my first book, The Puerto Rican Syndrome. I will just limit myself to two remarks. First, the unconscious is both social and historical. Then the unconscious spreads the subjective positions in a great variety of ideological positions. Freud is both the dead commander of the Spanish fortress under siege, and also he's the victorious American admiral asking for his breakfast. What was his desire? Of course, he wanted to understand the logic of dreams, but also to assuage a moment of anxiety triggered by war, bombardment, and universal destruction, by concluding in almost a humorous way when instead of a warship, he sees only a tiny breakfast sheet appear. When Freud had this dream, he was establishing the foundations of psychoanalysis and of the meaning of dreams. Strikingly, Lacan commands this dream and names this revelatory moment the discovery of the crowd in oneself. He states that this crowd is structured like the Freudian crowd. Is Lacan here referring to his community of followers, present and to come, the one whose desire and ideological demands so thoroughly Tupinambá explores? What is Lacan doing when he puts the dream side by side with the Freudian crowd, specifically the crowd analyzed by Freud in Masse en Psychologie? He locates an analogy in their structures. The dream and the crowd are formations of the unconscious that result from a failed jouissance and are as such equivalent to other formations of the unconscious, like parapraxis, slips of the tongue, symptoms, or as Tupinambá demonstrates, also psychoanalytic theory, practice, and institutions. It is well known that the dream of Irma functioned as the royal path to unconscious desire, and if dreams and the Freudian crowd share a common structure, they can be read as what Lacan describes as immixing of subjects. This structures the dialectics of intersubjectivity and takes place when a subject interacts, mixes with things or with other subjects as counterpart. Using this set of equivalence, one could better understand how the ahistoricity of the unconscious is traversed by history, how the political is articulated with the subjective, how the sexual and the group life are intertwined. The crowd illustrates the relationship of each member with their own image. If Lacan compares the dream to the Freudian crowd, it is precisely because this crowd, according to Lacan's reading of Freud, is structured as the image of the body of the subject, but this is a perhaps polycephalic subject, or even, as Lacan says, an acephalic, headless subject, which speaks the discourse of the unconscious. The acephalic subject speaks beyond the ego, the nonsense of the dream, and reveals a knowledge, for instance, in the case of Freud, of the arrival of the Spanish-American War. Inspired by what we may call a sort of acephalic discontent that reveals the truth while confronting the possibilities and limits of groups, organizations, with some colleagues, we have created a space for community structures beyond individualism and your standard psychoanalytic crowd. I am a co-founder of Das Unbehagen, a loose collective of psychoanalysis, mostly organized around people located in New York and the East Coast, but from other geographical locations as well. And it's a group of clinicians, academics, artists, and intellectuals. It is an association formed for the investigation of psychoanalysis free from the constraints of institutes and other authorizing bodies, including local and national organizations. The Unbehagen has created a space where members can learn to be practitioners of the unconscious. We function as a group of peers, creating a series of lateral relationships with those who likewise seek to revitalize psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic practice in an ethical manner. We organize study groups, reading groups, peer supervision, working groups, and offer support structure for those taking on analytic work independently. In that way, the Zumbehagen has given a new impetus to Freud's and Lacan's discovery. The utopia of this association has been to be radically acephalic. There are no dues, no membership, no board, no leader. Everybody can participate with ideas and propositions. Therefore, nobody can be excluded, and nobody has ever been excluded. And moreover, not everybody is Lacanian in the Zumbehagen. Some are Kleinian, others are relational. For myself, being a Lacanian in the United States is not being any kind of Freudian, but a political Freudian, that is a critical Freudian. And at times, I'm also a critical Lacanian as well, an analyst intervening in the field so as to redefine it and reinvent it. I will take an example, another experiment we may call, of political debate with this non-institution, a recent event that was triggered by an open letter that I co-signed. The letter was sent to the analytic community early in last year in 2020, in March. It was the very first week of the lockdown, and a group of psychoanalytic colleagues from the Zumbehagen sent me a draft of a letter. I added a few words, and I signed. The letter was posted on a listserv and then on Facebook, and the letter turned viral, burned after reading. The open letter that was circulated initially in an online thread under the title Helpless was eventually published in translation in the European Journal of Psychoanalysis and had an effect that was contagious. And it was, interestingly enough, very well received by colleagues in Europe and Latin America, but created a bitter polemic with North American colleagues. It was clearly written very early in the pandemic, and we thought that we had a tone of restraint and pessimism, even of despair. We were reacting to an inflated optimism prevailing in the American media, especially among pop psychologists. For instance, the magazine Psychology Today was giving all kinds of upbeat advice, and that this was a wonderful opportunity to reconnect with house partners, spend more time with your children, do yoga online, relax, binge, watch movies. In a way, they were also mentioning in passing the potential for trauma, but they were, above all, maintaining what we felt was a cruel and irresponsible optimism, a sort of fake triumphalist tone. Some even described the lockdown as an opportunity to take a forced vacation. And when it came to psychoanalysis, it was a unique chance to try new and interesting ad hoc techniques. It is true that we may have reacted a little too violently to this American optimism, a sense of hope at any price that triggered a false optimism. But what we did above all was to express our impotence facing the enormity and the unknown of the circumstances at that early stage in the pandemic. Already, what we knew then is that some members of the community of psychoanalysts in New York had died because of the virus. We have a community, especially in New York, where most of the psychoanalysts are quite elderly. Facing the stark reality of death, we asked maybe impertinent questions to our fellow analysts. I will quote very briefly from the letter. What does it mean to do psychoanalysis in a situation like this? Why is it immediately assumed to be a good or even a necessity? Can we dare ask if our services were best utilized otherwise or perhaps afterwards? And if we want people to question themselves so thoroughly, should we not also, especially in times as desperate as this, seriously do so ourselves? End quote. We thought we were simply making a call to psychoanalysts to occupy a defined place, to analyze our actions, to share our impotence, and was interpreted as we were reproaching. They saw us Lacanians, purists, dogmatic, orthodox guardians of the couch, accusing others of not doing rigorous psychoanalysis because they were using Zoom or the phone. They believed that we were telling them, don't do anything, give up, as if we were chastising them for trying to do something in dire circumstances. Looking back on the evolution of the pandemic, our pessimism was justified. We were asking our colleagues to remain alert and hear past the optimistic noise, for instance, of Trump's advice that was better to let older people die because of COVID rather than having younger people commit suicide because of an economic crisis. We asked them to remain skeptical, to question and to listen. A letter, for instance, inspired responses in other publications in Division Review, from which I quote the psychoanalyst Philip Gendron wrote, "In light of the very grim statistic and tragic experiences, political issues are finally noticed, and with hopefully no possibility of a positive spin as a consequence of this crisis that can no longer be ignored, dismissed, rationalized, or even interpreted psychoanalytically," end quote. So we were pointing at the limits of political action, throwing light onto the political dimension that was dismissed, that was perhaps forgotten, with a pressing need to wash our hands regularly and keep our psyches as disinfected as possible. We were reminding our colleagues that psychoanalysis is not an orthopedics underpinned by a myth of cleanliness or normalization. And we were pointing to an irreducible discontent that nevertheless has an emancipatory potential because it can free us from superego mandates as psychoanalysis radically opposes any adaptationist purpose. For those who were offended by our tone of despair, I think it was important to remind them that there were some that were not as traumatized as one would expect. Some even relished the fact that everything had slowed down, that had almost stopped. And some patients were doing well. They were able to continue working productively in their exclusively remote treatments. Everyone reduced to a stamp in the philatelic rendering of Zoom, getting ahead despite of everything. In my own practice, I saw and this is something I share with many colleagues here in the US, my workload increased enormously. I received many new patients in the middle of a global catastrophe. And many of them are making very good progress. Nothing like a global deadly pandemic to remind us of mortality and facing death. Many felt there was no time to procrastinate. But one thing that was proof that we were wrong about regarding the pandemic, that we thought that was proved wrong by experience, was thinking that the virus was an equalizer, that rich and poor were affected equally. One may think that disasters would not discriminate. The experience in the US, however, showed that poor Black and brown Latinx people are 3 times more likely than whites to get COVID and were killing the highest members by the pandemic, exposing long-standing inequities by race, ethnicity, and income. The promise of the virus as a great social equalizer was proved wrong. This makes me return to my work as a psychoanalyst in the barrio clinics where a similar inequality exists. I want to reiterate that it has been my experience working as a psychoanalyst with marginalized, racialized communities suffering high rates of mortality, that psychoanalysis can function as a life-affirming practice. The dismissal of working psychoanalytically with racialized minorities that often experience higher degrees of poverty is often constructed as if they are two other, and I think this is worth highlighting, since Tupinambá opens his book here with a discussion of the accessibility to treatment, claiming that those who may be able to do analysis as a reduced fee will most likely never become psychoanalysts. On chapter 5, The Political Economy of Clinical Practice, he concludes that, quote, "Psychoanalysis as a profession remains for now economically impossible," end quote, and closes the book with a critique of Lacan's model of the past, hoping to give opportunity to, quote, "those who have no means to pay for sessions for years and years," end quote. I will not take money as a contingent solution as Tupinambá proposes, but rather as one of the 2 reals we have in the treatment, time and money. And since time is money, we use variable session length. variable length session, sorry. It's often said short session, and I hesitated trying to counter this, I think, misconstruction of the practice. If it's always short, why not 50 minutes? It should be always variable. It's in the variation that the key operator is at stake. The analysan is not paying by the minute for a session that belongs to, but something that belongs to a process. For analysis includes also the time between sessions. Those critics who voice their enraged indignation at what they consider a major transgression of a supposedly fair business etiquette forget that the cat is a hint that analysis is terminable. I agree with Tupinambá that the exchange of money merits attention, since money often goes from the analysant's pockets to the analysts. But is money the only way one pays for analysis? Often the asymmetry does not stop there, that one pays for analysis with the jouissance one gives up. And another point of asymmetry has been noted by Neil Altman, who observed that the social location of practitioners, psychologists or psychoanalysts, is usually within the professional managerial class. And this dominant class is described by Altman as very insecure, quote. They have nothing more tangible by way of capital to hold on than their knowledge and expertise. I will argue that precisely this capital that could place the analyst in a position of domination is what the analyst gives up in order to assure the progress of the cure. Thus, the injuries inflicted by the current social structure and interpersonal conflict and alienation that are its derivatives will be de facto transformed by the nature of the analytic relationship. As Raúl Moncayo points out, the Lacanian analytic relationships overcomes the model of interactive domination because it neutralizes the class-bound master position by offering a different mode of social link, analytic discourse. Moncayo argues that the analyst work progresses because it assumes that the symptom is something uncontrolled by the subject to which certain knowledge is attributed. These two factors, which are at the basis for the establishment of any transferential relationship, allow the treatment to start, and the knowledge that the analyst will attribute to the analyst, what Altman calls capital, dissolves from the Lacanian perspective that describes the role of the analyst as shaped by ignorantia docta, or wise ignorance, as systematized by Nicholas Kousanos. While the analyst operates in a place of wise ignorance, the supposed knowledge or capital is transferred to the patient. The analyst's initial idealization, because of transference of the analyst, will eventually let the analyst fall from the position of subject supposed to know, and the analyst containing the symptom will emerge not from the analyst's expertise or knowledge, but from the analyst's unconscious. And this shift requires that the analyst should direct the analyst should direct the cure towards the supersession of illusions, among which the illusion of the analyst's capital would also be given up. And this experience, this transformation, has an effect that is transformative and introduces a new form of social link not regulated by the master's model, but by the analyst's desire for difference, offering not only a new relation to one's unconscious, but also a restitution of capital, the capital of knowledge from which the analyst had been alienated. In the process, what is provided for the analysant is the experience of a new model of social rule, which is of particular importance for oppressed racialized minorities. So here I want to highlight the emancipatory potential of the exploration of the unconscious that has a great promise for oppressed minorities. And of course, psychoanalysis not only deals with unconscious replaced conflict, it also encourages the exploration of fantasy, gives great importance to dream life as metaphors of desire. Free associations expands the imagination and opens space for futurity beyond the constraints of repetition, enabling the capacity for change at both a personal and societal level. Psychoanalysis, instead of enforcing adaptation to oppressive social conditions, makes for subjective agency. So again, I won't reiterate this, and I oppose the assumption that poor people lack the sophistication that psychoanalysis requires, because this idea reinforces rigid class boundaries, and I can offer the proof of my clinical practice directly engaging marginalized communities, be it by race, class, gender, or sexuality. For instance, in my private practice, I offer a sliding scale fee. And I maintain a practice of what I call unconditional welcome. And that this allows me to see patients of all socioeconomic backgrounds. And besides English, I speak both Spanish and Portuguese. So this, for instance, allows me, there's a big Brazilian community in Philadelphia where I live, and I can see undocumented Brazilian patients, and I have been working with cleaning persons, construction workers, and in that way I bring back the barrio into my quote unquote middle-class bourgeois private office setting. So here we see that at the intersection of psyche and community, we can address modalities of individual suffering that are also allegories of social conditions. And I think this is a crucial step towards making psychoanalysis accessible to all who can benefit from it. Since psychoanalysis operates in the echoes of language in the body, but the truth is that we don't know certainly what the body is or what extent language is affected, this crossroad is where my clinical practice lies. There are those who question what is to be a man or a woman, and their survival in a mortal and sex body becomes precarious. Or I derive my work with transgender analysis from strategies to overcome this precariousness that are proposing new frontiers of the body, not a body one is born into, but a body that one becomes. With hysterical patients from the barrio, a similar problem persists. Bodies affected by history, individual symptoms placed at the intersection of the social and the individual, symptoms that speak through the body, a body that, as William Burroughs said, is affected by the virus of the word of language. And here is where psychoanalysis is particularly equipped to play a unique role. We are suffering in the middle of an epidemic also of inequities. The recent mass protests that spread in the United States threw light on the marginalization and discrimination suffered by Black Americans. Slavery, legalized racial segregation, high rates of incarceration, unanswered calls for action combined with racism, even beyond death, with pervasive injustice occurring in the aftermath of police killings of unarmed Black Americans. And at the same time, disproportional COVID infection and death, further exposing this deadly structural racism. After the pandemic, with the growing awareness of violent discrimination, gathered with the impact of Black Lives Matter movement, it appears clearly that no psychoanalyst can be immune to the political context in which we work. We can no longer imagine that we are outside history. And it's in revealing that most of the people with whom we co-signed the letter I referred to earlier organized during the summer a series of online discussions of the whiteness of psychoanalysis and in relation to Afro-pessimism feature, among others, Frank Wilderson. Wilderson, in his book Afro-pessimism, explains that the curse of slavery has not yet been lifted, that the subjugated position of African American prevents them from ever being regarded as human beings. And this structural exclusion would place them in a position of what Orlando Patterson describes as social death, a deathliness that saturates Black life. If that letter was written today, it might be seen less as a document expressing our own personal pessimism, that as one engaging in a dialogue with Afro-pessimism, which implies that we all have to be aware that in psychoanalysis, at least, we must take into account the death drive and work at the unconscious intersection of race, class, and gender. Today, Lacan's contributions have broken free from the academic fortress and are being progressively appreciated among clinical practitioners, early career analysts who find in Lacan's perspective not only something that is clinically illuminated but socially woke, that is, alert to injustice in society, especially racism. We know that the contributions of Lacan have influenced Black studies from the 1950s to the present. And in turn, the Black studies framework has challenged Lacanian thinking in its understanding of racial segregation. For instance, Lacan is quoted several times by Fanon to debunk racism. Fanon, on the other hand, criticizes Octave Manoni. And this debate has been echoed in several times in recent work from Afro-pessimism thinkers, but it's offering also critical tools as to explicate the unconscious dynamics of structural anti-Blackness. Another area of Lacanian thought that has made a considerable, if contested, contribution, where Lacanian thought is, I think, maybe revisited and further explored, as Tupinambá's book is asking us to do, has been, as you may all know, gender study. More than 30 years ago already, Judy Butler ignited a new way of thinking about gender that blazed across global academia. Perhaps going against the grain of Butler's performative notion of sexuality and gender, the last 2 decades have seen what we may call a transgender term in psychoanalysis in the emerging field of trans psychoanalytics, a critical collaboration between psychoanalysis and trans studies. And in this emerging domain, Lacan's influence is considerable. Jacques-Alain Miller may have been alerted about this development, and in the last weeks has engaged, finally, we may say, gender issues. Most recently in the text Docile to Trans, that several of us referred to, was published very recently on April 25th as part of a 100-page special issue of Lacan Quotidien under the banner 2021 Trans Year, and circulated in English online in the Lacanian Review. There, Miller takes a very condescending tone, facing what he sees as an American importation of values. And he contradictorily says that Lacan did not say much about the topic, but has been there before. Besides documenting Miller's transphobia, as some of Tom Sick noted, or his irrelevance, as observed by Žižek earlier today, the text also shows us as if there is a Miller one should listen to here, is not Jacques-Alain, but his grandson, quote, the last of the Millers, the youngest heir to the name, 16 years old, an environmental activist, a fan of mathematical physics and in search of the lost time, end quote, who, facing his grandfather's inclination for misgendering, quote, lectures me on gender. You mustn't say, Jacques-Alain, that he has become a girl. It's upsetting. Accept what he says with respect and kindness. End of the story, end quote. If there was some hope, Miller missed the boat since he seems indifferent to the effect of Paul Preciado's, even though Paul Preciado is mentioned in that text, because Paul Preciado had made, not that long ago, a momentous presentation in November of 2019, shaking his own École de la cause freudienne by addressing the numerous audience of psychoanalysts, addressing them with the traditional ladies and gentlemen, adding that he was not sure whether the greeting could be extended to those who, quote, are neither ladies nor gentlemen, because I believe that there is no one among you who has legally and publicly renounced sexual difference and who has been accepted as a psychoanalyst after having successfully achieved the past, end quote. In that talk, then Paul became Peter, calling up Kafka's story, a report to an academy. Addressing the audience, Preciado talked from, quote, my case of a transsexual man, like a human monkey of the new era, I as a trans body, as a non-binary body, to which neither medicine nor law nor psychoanalysis nor psychiatry recognize the right to speak or the possibility of producing a uniform discourse of knowledge about myself. I, like Peter the Red, am able to access the language of the colonial patriarchy. That is your language. I'm here to address you, end quote. Preciado's lecture was received by many as a provocation, by others as an attack, and by a very few as an overdue recognition of a silence issue. Preciado concluded his lecture with a plea, interrupted by applause. Quote, to begin a process of depatriarchalization, de-heterosexualization, and decolonialization of psychoanalysis. End of quote, and concluded, anticipated, quote, a mutant psychoanalysis around this paradigm mutation, perhaps only this process of transformation, however terrible and dismantling as it may seem to you, deserves today again to be called psychoanalysis, end quote. I applaud both Preciado and Tupinambá's call for a transformation of psychoanalysis. As Preciado concluded, quote, I think that you will be able to keep your place and the place you have historically invented as long as you will be able to enter into dialogue with and be in relation to the present with the contemporary political radicalness, end quote. Like Tupinambá demonstrates, this could only be accomplished if psychoanalysis takes desire seriously as its theoretical, clinical, and ethical compass. Lacan's famous exhortation, do not yield on your desire, while touted by many, has nevertheless often been misinterpreted as a moral injunction. Do not yield on your jouissance, as though Lacan was handing out free passes to a Sadian Disneyland. For Lacan, the divided subject is condemned to desire. Even when fulfilled, it fails to deliver on its promise. This failure is desire itself, a principle of negativity, protecting us from the ravages of jouissance and keeping us on the side of life. Desire is not linked to happiness or the pursuit of the good. Lacan underlines this point in the Seminar on Ethics, saying, there is no good other than that which may serve to pay the price for access to desire, end quote. Miller, in his Docile to Trans text, calls up, by way of Wikipedia, Valery Solana and decries that today, quote, everything conspires to depreciate, ridicule, and drive out masculine values, end quote, claiming evidence of female supremacy everywhere. Yeah, yes, evidence of female supremacy. Solana, as well, is the inspiration for Andrea Longchu, who argues in the appropriately titled Females, her 2019 book, that, quote, everyone is female and everyone hates it. This is a lesson I take from Andrea Longchu, that she considers transition not in terms of identity, but of desire. She writes, quote, how can you want to be something you already are? Desire implies deficiency. Want implies want. What makes women like me transsexual is not identity, but desire, end quote. So it's interesting in connection with some of the comments this morning Slavoj Žižek made, that Chu is avoiding the discourse of authenticity. Chu conceives of desire as in its own non-arrival as a prime mover. I quote her again. Trans women want things too. The deposits of our desires run as deep and fine as any, end quote. And also in females, Chu writes, quote, most desire is non-consensual. And in a chapter devoted to pornography, she says, all the ways we try to engage with it, hide from it, ignore it, indulge it, inevitably shape us. Desire for Chu is gender's centrifugal force, is what makes us all so female to begin with. In a feisty title of the New York Times op-ed that you may recall from Chu, titled My New Vagina Won't Make Me Happy and It Shouldn't Have to, takes explicit distance from the eudaimonistic ideal that prescribes transitioning with the ultimate goal of achieving happiness. Chu writes, quote, transition doesn't have to make me happy for me to want it. Left to their own devices, people will rarely pursue what makes them feel good in the long term. Desire and happiness are independent agents, end quote. Indeed, happiness is often invoked to deploy by political mechanisms of discipline, as Foucault has shown us, quote, to neutralize dangers, to fix useless or disturbed populations, allegedly increasing the utility of individuals, end quote. Within psychoanalytic theory, certain disciplines, long-standing assumptions for some gender formation and psychosexual development still prevail, such as duality of sex, the foundational role of sexual difference, and a parental, mostly heterosexual couple as a key context and reference structures. As transgender experiences and embodiments become more variegated, they challenge the fixicity of the binary of sex difference and narratives of an authentic gender that must be discovered, established, and kept in place. The tenets of the duality of sex, the nuclear family structured by the heterosexual couple, and the primacy of sexual difference are so intricately bound up with now disavowed histories of coloniality and structural whiteness. Chu, to conclude, I will wrap up by saying that Chu may not be happy, but she's having fun. Nature has, after all, a sense of humor. As Hegel and Žižek have noted, perhaps sex is a joke of nature, since it, quote, combines the organ of its highest fulfillment, the organ of generation, with the organ of urination, end quote. Whether you play it straight or not, the Lacanian sexuation comedy uses the mask of desire to perform a multiplicity of roles. As Alenka Zupančič's original work of comedy debunked tragedy as the paradigmatic psychoanalytic model of critique, we know that clinically, comedy offers a more productive model, as we proposed with Manja Stan-Kohler in 2016. Comedy is so productive because it's on the side of life. Unlike tragedy, where everyone dies at the end, in comedy, the hero jumps into the soup to become laughing stock, only to jump out again, making do with life in all its happenstance and finitude, in all its unbearable absurdity. Gabriel Tupinambá's brilliant book is a wake-up call from the deadly failed jouissance of Lacanians. In a footnote in the interpretation of dreams, Freud writes, quote, "No doubt, a wish fulfillment must bring pleasure, but the question then arises, to whom?" Many thanks. Thank you.
Wonderful, Patricia. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have many questions that have already come in. We have extended this as planned to 2:30 Eastern. That gives us about half an hour. What I think might be best is to do the following. We'll have one question for Alenka, one question for Patricia, kind of back to back, back to back. If you also wish to ask one another any questions, that would be welcome. And then we'll conclude with kind of Gabriel's comments back. Okay, so the first one I want to raise for Alenka Zupančič is the following. You've received a question from Yasha, which I think is a good one, and I'll read it. Is there for you a relation between the Cartesian subject, which appears when doubt appears as certainty, and Badiou's faithful subject, the subject that is faithful to the infinite consequences of an event? Do you see any way of locating these two powerful notions of the subject, the first concerning the unconscious and the second with a future novelty, in a larger conceptual space that might include them both or think them both together?
Yeah, do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for this question. I think this is a very good question. I agree, and I think there is a way of thinking these two things together. Actually, okay, this is my partisanship in the broader context also of Lacanian theory, because there is a slight difference, I think, between this Badiou's conception, I simplify a little bit, but in which there is no subject before the event. So event is something that disrupts, let's say, the business as usual confines of configurations that are already in place. So after the event, it follows this kind of fidelity where the subject of certain certainty, of this declared certainty, kind of emerges, clinging on to nothing else but this kind of risky declaration, uncertain in itself, but nevertheless existing powerfully through the subject. And I think what we have in Descartes, and this is, I think, what he brings in from in Lacan, what he brings in from Descartes, is that subject is not only this thing that follows, this kind of subjectivation that follows the event, but it also, as I briefly mentioned at the end, a kind of antagonism or the gap in the very structure. And it is something happens with this antagonism, with this negativity when an event appears. So it kind of mobilizes this structure. This is not a conscious or unconscious subject, but something of this. So there is this doubt, which is nothing else but this kind of radical negativity. But at the same time, it kind of flips into something which is then a subjective fidelity, could be then a subjective fidelity to this particular event or not. So I know this remains kind of abstract, but yeah, this would be my kind of very quick response. So there is a way, I think, of conceiving them together with all the differences also, that there's some differences that exist at this level.
Okay, very good. I personally found your probing of the question of a return to, in light of Tupinamba's Lacanian ideology and critique of logic of signifier and its regionalization, what then would the consequences be for the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis? That's an incredibly interesting thing, which maybe Gabriel can touch upon. Patricia, Colin asks, what do you believe accounts for the excessive and angry reactions to the letter that you mentioned that was posted on the psychoanalytic listservs? Is this merely typical infighting amongst the schools, the aggressive reaction of those privileged practitioners who are unwilling to look more closely at it, or is there something more going on there?
Yes, I think what was perhaps not said very clearly in that letter and became clear afterwards, the Nachtraglicht of the situation, was that we were in a position of despair by wanting to question in a more critical way, not giving for granted to a role a bigger importance that it should have. I think I decided to sign that letter because I wasn't sure, I didn't know whether or not it was going to be useful for me to continue working as a psychoanalyst, that what can one offer? And that's why I found very helpful this observation of Gabriel, of the unrealness of the analytic setting that could produce a space, a sort of bubble away from the pandemic, but is nevertheless traversed by it. There has been a drastic change in the way we practice. We all have to start working either on the phone or on Zoom. So the usual theater, the staging of the treatment has changed dramatically. And for some psychoanalysts, they now are considering not necessarily going back to in-person meeting. In my own practice, I think that it's important to have two bodies in the same room because you introduce the dimension of the drive. I think the drive that was perhaps inspiring the writing of the letter was the confrontation with the death drive and maybe our own in being very pessimistic and questioning and trying to take distance from, I made reference to psychology today. They were saying, oh, this is great. You can go for free to museums. You can listen to concerts for free on your computer. This is like a sort of candid version of the world. This is the best of worlds. The pandemic will bring us all together in disaster. And I think what was denying that optimism is the political dimension of the inequality, that death did not make us equal, that rich people and poor people don't die in the same way. And worse of that, if poor people are poor people of color, black and brown people die 3 times more than white people. So in a way, was, I think, a leftover of a certain apoliticization of psychoanalysis. And in no way we wanted to criticize those who wanted to do something. Why not? We were also still working, and I never stopped working, and none of the people who signed the letter stopped their practices. But we wanted to take distance from a certain death optimism that let's continue. The band has to go on playing business as usual. And rather than separate it, this is a citizen. We may intervene differently, but as psychoanalysts, we also have a responsibility, being aware of maybe the limits of our practice, that perhaps is it the most useful thing to do in a pandemic to continue doing business as usual? And this is, I think, why the letter was perhaps misinterpreted. But then reading back the letter, we felt that we were maybe closer to the discourse of Afro-pessimism that we were aware of.
Thank you, Patricia. Alenka, I want to turn to you with another theoretical question, which I think is a good one from Danielle, who says, in your discussion of Descartes and Freud, in light of Gabriel's enclosure, the notion of the enclosure of the space of free association or regionalization, it has a question regarding subjects supposed to know. Is subject supposed to know something that we only associate with the position of the analyst? Is not precisely subject supposed to know an artificial way to subtract the Cartesian doubt from speech so that the analyst can talk as if he or she can speak without doubt, and then doubt becomes, and doubt will come after as a question of the impasses of the transference and of the position of the analyst? I hope that makes
yeah, no, I think I understand the question, and the way I would answer, I mean, okay, I'm not practicing analysis, but I can gather this much from what is happening there from other accounts, starting with Freud. I think what Lacan means and what I meant here is that within the analytic confines, there seems to be all the time this kind of occasions where the analysand doubts her or his statement while speaking. So that there is this reoccurring, but I'm not sure if this is, I'm really not sure if this is so, this was not my mother, or I will, so that there is this kind of doubt that is actually part of the speech, of the thoughts that are presented, and which is there precisely as a kind of a orienteer or guiding point of a certain certainty that as analyst one can detect. Of course, there is no automatism. One still needs to hear it. There is no automatic translation, or very rarely. But so I don't think that subject supposed to know is there to suspend this doubt. I think the doubt perhaps really fully emerges precisely with this supposition. And there is another interesting thing that happens with this. I think Lacan comments on this at some point, namely that with the psychoanalytic setting, the fear is not that the other is cheating us or that manipulating us, but that actually we as analysants, we are constantly afraid that the other will not get what we are saying, that we will be able to deceive the other, that actually with our, even perhaps unconsciously, we will not say what we really want to say. So there is this interplay, and I think there is a lot of real that, and my point was simply that this is not something that, I mean, obviously it gets produced in a different way in this setting and encouraged and also listened to in a different way. But nevertheless, I think it is the doubt of analysand which is at stake. And this doubt, I don't think constantly not being sure, doubting this or that, is that this disappears. So if I understood the question correctly, this would be my answer.
Excellent. I think that's very good. Very good. I want to turn to Patricia, a question from Brendan, who asks, can you speak to the difference between your writing on the hysteric with trans symptoms in relation to Malherbe's recent docile to trans intervention, where he describes trans activists as the first hysterics to demand empowerment qua hysterics. I think that's a very interesting and timely question.
Sure. I think already if we think of the choice of title docile, introduces a notion of domination. And paradoxically, that text evokes Freud. And Miller mentions, well, what did Freud do with the hysteric? He was docile to them. And I would disagree. I don't think Freud was docile to the hysteric. He was an analyst. I mean, an analyst is not in a position, supposedly, and that's why I was making reference to the transformation, is we are not within the master discourse. We hopefully, if analysis happens, and only happens if somebody lies on the couch believing that the person sitting behind is an analyst. I think the power of psychoanalysis resides in the possibility that an analyst would assume that the other person in the room could be positioned as their analyst. That is not one of domination, but one of a desire for difference and hoping that some truth will emerge in the situation. And another element I think maybe Brendan is referring to, that my position has taken distance from a classical position among Lacanians, which is to assume that any expressions or any transgender form of expression is necessarily a sign of psychosis, which I think is evidences that they have very little clinical experience with trans-identified analysis. It's true, I had some psychotic patients who happen to express themselves within the trans identity, but that's not the only manifestation I had encountered in the clinic. I have had, if we use the diagnosis matrix offered by the Lacanian thinking, some that were psychotic, some that were in a perverse position, and many that were the garden variety neurotic, many hysterics, others obsessional. So I don't think it's helpful clinically to think of transgender expressions as a clear sign of a specific structure. That's why I work with them as symptom, as something that could eventually become a symptom. Not even a symptom in the medicalized way, not something you want to cure, but something that maybe is a unique singular invention that makes life possible, or life livable. Because one thing that I think could help us introduce a new dimension that could be, I think, of interest, since many of you, I imagine, are philosophers, not clinicians perhaps, is that what I discovered working with the analysts who identify as trans is that behind a question of gender, there was an issue of life and death. Sum up, when somebody comes and says, if I would not have transition, I would have killed myself. So it's not about identity as much as it is an issue of finding a livable embodiment. And it's an issue of life and death. And then we're talking about something else that could maybe overcome certain silly dead ends that I think are parodical and not taking you. I think this text of Miller is not, that doesn't have other merit than it's been a self-indictment.
That's very honestly refreshing. As a Lacanian myself, it's very refreshing to hear you say these things. So thank you, Patricia. One more quick comment for you, or question from Alex Colson, which is, he's wondering, and then Alenka, we will immediately go to Gabriel's response to some of the deeper questions that you raised in a moment. Okay, can you elaborate on the tension between the success of Latin American clinics due to their political function as an institution, with the political neutrality of the clinical practice itself, so far as it is split off from reality, as you put it? How precisely does this work? Alex also likes the idea of, quote, you don't approach a symptom as a militant. Can you also elaborate on that point?
Yeah, I don't want to generalize because there have been, and maybe Gabriel, and if there are Brazilians in the audience, we know that there have been analysts in the right and analysts involved in torture. There is a horrible example in Brazil. Same in Argentina, you have people on the right. And even the paradoxical thing that even the former dictators would apologize to the audience using psychoanalytic vocabulary, would say, well, we have to overcome the trauma of the horrible things we have done to the population. So I don't think it's necessarily a discourse of liberation, but that we don't need to neglect the emancipatory potential that a clinical practice can have when, if I give the example of my experience in the barrio, people who are all the time treated like infantilized, treated like children, treated like objects, that they can be taken at their word and reinstated in their full agency as grammatical subjects. And that has an incredible effect and could be, I think, an important contribution from the clinical standpoint. And that in Argentina, if that's the example I know the better, there have been institutions more on the right, but the majority of the institutions have been left-leaning, and that in any case, nobody could ever think of themselves as a psychoanalyst without having to take a political stand. And this is the tension. Once you take a political stand, you become a citizen. And I think that's why it's so absurd to expect that the members of an institute have to vote for a specific presidential candidate, as Gabriel shows in his book. It's totally against psychoanalytic ethics. Going back to the issue, I would then say that on the other hand, a psychoanalyst who does deny their political responsibility are in an anti-psychoanalytic position. And I like to mention, that's why I mentioned Elizabeth Danto, I like to be reminded of the history that Freud not only was talking between the two world wars of a psychoanalysis for the people. The word in English, lay analysis, laikos, comes from the Greek for the people. So that psychoanalysis that pretends to be only for the upper classes is anti-psychoanalytic. And there is another thing that we forget, and that's why history teaches a lot, is that in the early days of psychoanalysis, there was a very brief collaboration between Freud and the Berlin Institute and Hirschfeld, who was an open activist for LGBT, what today we will call LGBTQ rights. So that there was this awareness of Freud, of the necessity of an engagement with what Paul Preciado calls radicalness. And that indeed, then humans are humans, and then there are all these conflicts and people, I think there is, an antagonism between psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalytic institution. And I think it's described very well already by Freud in group psychology. It's described by discontent culture, like Das Unbehagen, the original title in German, so that there is a constant tension between psychoanalytic theory and psychoanalytic institutions. And I think this is what is wonderfully analyzed by Tupinambá's book, that what's happening with the psychoanalytic institutions that end up simply becoming anti-psychoanalytic, in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. Okay, Gabriel will give you the floor for 10 minutes. If you want to have exchange with Alenka, that can be welcome as well. So,
well, first of all, I can't thank you both enough for your presentations. I mean, Alenka was my supervisor in my doctorate thesis, but much more than that, was a ridiculously huge influence in my way of thinking. And also Patricia's work, I've always followed with interest, also shaped a lot of the questions that I ended up pursuing in this book. So it's a pretty good opportunity. Actually, I think that some of the questions that I understood Alenka to be raising, I think can be clarified, at least my position, by referring to some of the things that Patricia brought from her experience as an analyst. So in an interesting way, I think it can clarify how something so abstract and ridiculously speculative, like discussion of infinity and mathematics, actually is, if it serves to any purpose, I hope it serves the purpose of making intelligible as a necessary conceptual dimension of psychoanalysis, the sort of experience that Patricia just described for us. I mean, I'll just start from one point. I mean, to start from something from within the Žižekian universe. Žižek always refers to this famous line from Wagner, about the wound can only be healed by the spear that caused it. But there are many spears, and therefore there are also many traumas, let's say. And I would say one of the first hints I had that there might be something to work through conceptually in psychoanalysis as a kind of slightly different perspective came from a friend of mine who will be speaking in the afternoon, Ana. Ana participates in this collective called Margens Clínicas here in Brazil. And she once told me something that really struck me, and also I hear it again in Patricia's presentation and in the work of many friends in my own work, which is, she told me once, look, we work with people whose trauma is deeply associated with state violence and with the dictatorship in Brazil. And many of them went, because psychoanalysis acquired, Lacanian psychoanalysis acquired an important place in Brazilian society in the end of the dictatorship years in a certain way. And many of them underwent Lacanian analysis for years and years and years. But when it came the time to testify about the horrors of the dictatorship before this thing we had called the Truth Commission, Brazil is lagging behind in a monstrous way in the question of dealing with the dictatorship in Brazil. But when it came to the time of speaking about those traumatic experiences, they seemed untouched by 20 years of Lacanian analysis. How is it possible that you undergo analysis for 20 years and something is not actualized, not treatable by that sort of analytic setting? And this gave me the very vague intuition that the ear that listens is something you construct. And if you start a clinical project which is organized under the banner that the dictatorship did happen, the things that are possible to say and to be listened to in that setting will not be the same as if you go to a clinical practice that remains impervious to the reality of the country it's in. A Black person, a poor person who goes to an upper class clinical setting with all those pretty books, all the reception, whereas the only Black person in the building is in the reception. They go through the elevator, they sit in the waiting room, then they go in. The chance that they will have to that's truly a space for free association, it's actually hindered. It takes work to create a space for free association. And I think what Patricia was talking about with her experience in the barrios in Philadelphia is a really good example of the work it takes to actually establish a place that materially creates the possibility for free association. It doesn't come for free. There is some work behind it, and work sometimes requires learning what to do with gunshots, learning what to do with, crime. I know analysts who pick up the phone and call the police. It's so obscene to hear about criminal activity, for example, or analysts who don't listen to patients who voted for Bolsonaro in Brazil. They're already beyond, they're lost beyond salvation or something. So not all clinical settings get to be established. And so it's that idea, which I think might have some philosophical relevance, that it takes some formal work to be able to listen to certain forms. Not all transferential space can actualize anything. It takes work to do it. And there are no texts, and I think Patricia is an exception here, and gladly it's less exceptional these days, but it's still hard to find texts or seminars or a place for this in the formation of new analysts that address this work. How do we call this work? It's not the internal work of handling transference. It's the work of establishing a place that negotiates with reality enough so that transference can happen, free association can happen, a doubt with no ground can happen, that an unrelation can happen. It doesn't come for free. For example, in my position, I see absolutely no quibble with the Cartesian inheritance of psychoanalysis. The question is precisely that the Cartesian subject is unevenly distributed in the world, because the conditions for the Cartesian experience are unevenly distributed. It's just that it takes work for something universal to be possible. And that's where the discussion happens for me. Now, why does infinity have anything to do with this? It's not so much for me, though I'm really interested in the whole Badiou, Hegel, Lacan debate. It's not for me a philosophical matter. It's simply that when you look at the history of this discussion on infinity, it's not, I'm not sure if I would claim that counter axiom of infinity and that's it, that's the novelty. No, because that's what happened after that is that an unsolvable problem appeared called the continuum hypothesis. That's the interesting thing, not the axiom itself. It opened up the need for a lot of further exploration. And I think that there is something similar to this. I think that mathematical drama captures some ideas of this dramatic situation of what does it cost to institute a space that can actually listen to something new. When Preciado spoke to the French, the ECF or the WAP or whatever, whoever it was listening, the question is not what was said, but what are the limits to listening to this, right? You can address psychoanalysts, but there is no addressee to receive it. And that's the embarrassment of the institution there. I mean, they can't do anything with it. So my problem is, how do you construct an addressee at the level of what is being said? And that's where the work of forming an institution seems to be a condition for the efficacy of listening. If you cannot form that sort of material basis for listening under certain conditions, you can't listen to certain things. For example, concerning the example of the letter, which pretty much put on the table the fact that business cannot go as usual. I mean, if you don't tell certain patients that perhaps they shouldn't be spending their money during a global pandemic with analysis, they won't even feel like they can say certain things in analysis. Like it might save their analysis to treat money as something which is a matter of life and death. It's like, I don't know, you might continue, but at the same time, okay, hell is happening. Don't tell me this is not an issue, right? When you risk that, what are you doing? You're saying that certain things that could become the background of insignificant speech, nothing matters there. They might matter, so they come to the fore. They might operate in some way, I don't know what might be. And it costs something to uphold this. And today, I mean, I think that I'm not proposing a new phenomena for psychoanalysis, like we act differently. I think that there is a whole part of the history of psychoanalysis that already operates like this. Even what we're doing right now is exactly this. It's saying that something should continue to move on because what Freud and Lacan did shouldn't be dismissed. But it's not clinical, and it's not just the theory. It takes a lot of work to put together, you know, a lot of people to talk. So what's the status of this with regards to psychoanalysis? I think it's, for me, it's spot on to mention that it was, I'm happy to admit that I totally agree that the Slovene school has done more for a sort of institution of psychoanalysis than a lot of institutional groups. It fits much better this proposal in some ways than other things, but it's a big load to bear. I mean, it would be good if it was more of something everyone can do, and that was also more, let's say, had a better feedback structure with the practice, because there is a certain solitude, which I think groups like the Unbehagen group try to dispel a bit, because there is this whole strata of work that doesn't happen inside the individual clinical listening, but that conditions it, and it takes many forms throughout the world, and it took many forms with Freud as well, but we never know exactly how to name it when we come to describe the history of psychoanalysis. So I feel like there is a long history of this. And to give just one example, very concrete, about something that I think fits better into analytic theory if treated as an axiom rather than a name. For example, is Freud's very early on change of perspective with regards to genital satisfaction. It's well known that at first he had that idea that, well, it was already quite a revolutionary idea that sexuality is something that is constructed within life. It takes all sorts of bricolage to stabilize some form of satisfaction, but he still kept the idea that genital satisfaction was a sort of normative, the best possible scenario. And it took some years for him to say, if I have a bad news for everyone, even this is kind of fucked up. There is no escape. There is no way that's much better, where every situation here will be a bricolage in some way. That's not an empirical statement. I mean, he listened to some people. He didn't listen to everyone. What he did was to say, it is possible that the weirdest forms of libidinal organization are, subjectively viable. What's the status of that declaration? It's not a clinical statement because it requires something else. And I agree that it opens up to philosophy. I have absolutely no problem with the idea that these statements, they have a love affair with philosophy, but they do also open up to psychoanalysis itself. And I don't want to be seduced by the very good news that there is a good relationship between psychoanalysis and philosophy, not to address the very bad news that there is a very bad relationship between psychoanalysis and itself. Those two things are perfectly fitting together, but it's also a trap, I think, when one substitutes for another. They can live together very well, in my opinion. And sometimes one thing has had to carry the load that the other isn't. And even in politics, this is a bit problematic when, for example, the best place to assert that a radically different society can exist is in philosophy. I prefer that there are communist philosophers than they're not, but I tend to tell my communist philosopher friends that they should do that and also help out in some other more politically engaged project, which will look very small and very ridiculous in comparison, because what we can do is very little. But it also teaches some stuff that we cannot learn by going so quickly to the finish line, right?
Sorry, time check. First of all, if it's okay, we have 20 minutes till the next panel. I'd want to give people a chance to walk around.
Yeah, no, I can.
Let me also say though that Alenka has indicated maybe body language that you want to say something. So let's also let that happen. Maybe.
No, I can't just stop here. And
okay,
I already spoke way too much. I just want to thank you all so much.
Please.
No, so very briefly, I mean that there are lots of things that remain, and I think perhaps also some misunderstanding. I really think we are kind of fighting for the same cause or on the same side, but just because I think we really basically agree, but there are two levels where this discussion is taking place. And Descartes, you mentioning of Descartes, this is a kind of here I don't agree. You said no one Cartesian subject is not equally distributed in the world. Well, I think the only thing that Cartesian subject says is I think, and I think thinking is equally distributed in the world. What is not distributed in the same way is precisely the way this Colophon of Doubt gets articulated, what are the problems that emerge and what we can learn when we listen to them. And here I cannot agree more with all these claims that you made also in response to Slavoy's intervention, how to listen and to articulate the problems, the new problems, the different problems from this. This does not exclude the Cartesian subject. I think the moment you say some people don't think, and because this is how Lacan reads Descartes, unconscious are the thoughts. It's not some whatever Cartesian wisdom. So but then how this is then articulated and what, how not only open, because these are all these suspicious words, how capable you are of really listening, and I still kind of insist there of naming new problems. Also, okay, adding some axioms, we can debate this at some other point, but then because this truly makes a difference. And I think what happens with these most established Lacanian organizations is precisely often that there is a kind of colonial attitude. I mean, I was myself witnessing a PhD defense at Saint-Denis in Paris. I think it was Eric Laurent, the supervisor, I'm not even sure, from a Brazilian guy who became psychoanalyst. And at the end, I mean, there was this speech that for me coming from Slovenia was completely buffing, but nobody seemed to notice it even there because this was part of the, this is how, so at the end, they were saying to this candidate, okay, so now you successfully obtained your PhD degree and now you can go back to your country, like spreading the wisdom that you acquired here in Paris, where we know, I mean, I'm caricaturing only a really little bit. I mean, this, the whole intent was, okay, now you got, but now get back there where you came from and spread the gospel there. And I think there is a lot of this kind of attitude, and it's extremely non-productive, and that doesn't, help to anything. But so my point was really not to substitute philosophy with psychoanalysis, nor to, I mean, this was half joking, saying that there is a kind of institution like a third thing simply to, I mean, this was a kind of joking proposal, but I think that it is important not to separate or to kind of throw the philosophical dimension of Lacan out with the dirty water of its ideology. This was basically the argument that I was making.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Patricia.
But really, thank you, Gabriel, for everything.
Yeah, thank you to Gabriel for every intervention. It's been a really rich panel, 3.5 hours, 3 hours and 40 minutes. So that's quite.
So we need a break, yeah.
We need a little break, okay?
Desire. Inextinguishable.
So we'll stop and we'll be back with the final panel, which is in Portuguese, but it's same link. So the same link you came to this one, you use for that one. We will see you then. Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye.